Tonight, an unprecedented interview with an undercover FBI operative who secretly lives and works among the terrorists of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. His name is a national secret, but in 2012, Al-Qaeda knew him as Tamer el-Nouri. They thought he was a wealthy Arab American with seething anger at the United States, but in reality, he had dedicated himself to the war on terror the morning of 9/11.
I remember thinking, please God, don't let this be a terrorist attack. Please God. And that's how naive I was. That's how naive we all were at that time.
Tamer el-Nouri, one of his many aliases, immigrated from Egypt as a child and was raised in New Jersey in a traditional Islamic home.
We're not at war with Islam. We're at war with radicals. I am a Muslim. I am an American, and I've been serving my country for 22 years and counting. And I am appalled at what these animals are doing to my country while desecrating my religion.
Devoted to Islam and America, comfortable working alone amid killers, he was a rare find for the FBI's undercover counterterrorism group.
It's called the National Security Covert Operations Unit.
And what did the guys in the unit call it?
It's not the guys, it's me. I jokingly refer to it as the Dirty Arabs Group.
The Dirty Arabs Group. Yes. Your bosses must have loved that.
Dark humor is part of the trade. In a new book, American Radical, he writes about infiltrating terrorist groups at home and abroad. He wrote the book, he told us, so that fellow Americans could understand how the Islam he knows is tortured by terrorists trying to justify mayhem. We disguised him and changed his voice so he could tell us about one of the biggest investigations of his career. The target was a 30-year-old Tunisian who was working toward a PhD at a Canadian university. It was in 2012 that routine surveillance of Shahab Essegayer's phone calls and travels gave Canadian intelligence and the FBI reasons to worry.
Shahab was talking to some really bad folks overseas. He made 2 trips to Iran and a handful of other intelligence gathering evidence that was presented to us that led us to believe that we needed to figure out who he was.
Essegayer had a visa to attend an academic conference in the United States, so the FBI wanted Tamer el-Nouri to dangle himself as bait, just in case Essegayer was recruiting for Al-Qaeda.
What did you do then?
I crafted my legend and made myself recruitable. I wanted him to choose me. I wanted him to go to bed that night, wondering what he could do to become my friend.
His legend, or false biography, was that of a wealthy Arab-American real estate investor with a painful private grudge.
How did you meet?
We met on a flight from Houston to San Jose, California.
Not by accident.
We met on a flight from Houston to San Jose, California.
That planned accidental meeting in June 2012 is called a bump, as in bumping into someone. They boarded as strangers, and fate did the rest.
People were in his seat, people were in my seat. It was a legitimate mix-up. And as I was talking to the flight attendant, he noticed that I had a long beard, that I looked Middle Eastern, and probably was a Muslim. So he poked his head over and he said, "Bitakallam Arabi," which means, "Do you speak Arabic?" in Arabic. I said, "Taban, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh." And he looked at me and he said, "Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullah." I knew it. And then the conversation proceeded in Arabic. He then turned to the other flight attendant and said, "We must sit together." He insisted. He chose me.
The whole key to the thing is to make it their idea.
That's correct.
What is the process that you go through to get into one of these roles?
It starts that morning that I'm traveling, assuming I'm traveling covertly in alias. I take a shower and I put on, for this case, I put on Tamer's clothes. I put on Tamer's watch, his shoes. I drive Hammer's car. His wallet's in my pocket. His phone is on me. And I drive to the beach, and I sit at the beach, and I talk to myself out loud like a crazy person, reciting everything there is to know about Tamer el-Nouri, his company, his family, his legend, over and over.
The FBI created a history for Tamer el-Nouri, an online presence, an actual office for his investment company where a receptionist answered the phone. There were ownership records, a home, fake IDs, and, critical to the legend, there was a false personal tragedy. El-Nouri's fake background said that his mother had died of neglect in a U.S. hospital because of anti-Muslim discrimination. That lie completed the picture of a wealthy Arab American who had a reason to hate. Shahab Essegayer thought that his new friend was made to order, which of course he was. For 10 months, the men drew close. Essegayer twisted the Quran to justify attacking the West. He admitted that his trips to Iran were for meetings with a senior Al-Qaeda leader. Surveillance showed that Essegayer was checking Tamer el-Nouri's backstory, and one night in a basement in Toronto, el-Nouri was grilled by Essegayer and 3 accomplices.
What do you do? How do you do it? Is it real? Is it commercial real estate? Is it residential? What do you do when you fly here? What do you do here? It sounded like an interrogation.
This interrogation was so sharp, el-Nouri feared that his cover had been blown. He analyzed the room in case he had to escape.
But the cop within you had figured out where the exit was and had decided what order he was going to shoot the people in the room in, if it came to that.
Well, absolutely. At that point, as you get older and slower, you realize you always go for the young ones first.
Which leads me to ask, in all seriousness, where does the courage come from?
I can make the argument that you're probably more in danger crossing the street here in New York City than I am when I'm embedded in an Al-Qaeda cell. If my legend holds up, I'm worth so much more to them. Safe. They protect me more than they protect their own, because Tamer el-Nouri means access to the West.
He passed the grilling and was enlisted in what Al-Qaeda hoped would be its long, frustrated encore to 9/11.
He was planning on derailing a train from New York City to Toronto.
How was he going to do that?
Well, that changed multiple times. It was either brick up the tracks, use explosives. When the bottom line was that train was getting derailed over a bridge that had as little water as possible to ensure the deaths of everyone on that train.
Was this just some kind of pipe dream?
No, that was his tasking from Al-Qaeda.
The Via Rail train carries hundreds of passengers from New York to Toronto. In September 2012, Essegayer, el-Nouri, and another man cased this bridge near Toronto, the scene of the planned attack. As a surveillance team watched overhead, el-Nouri recorded Shahab Essegayer explaining how the disaster would unfold.
It would seem that you have plenty to arrest Shahab on at this point. Why does the investigation keep going?
Because Shahab revealed to me that there was an American sleeper. He told me that there was an American version of him, and that although he didn't know who he was told by his trainers, Al-Qaeda senior leadership, that they would put the two of them together when the time was right.
There was an Al-Qaeda American agent inside the United States.
That's what Shahab believed, and I believed him.
The possibility of an Al-Qaeda agent in America took the investigation in a new direction. Tamer el-Nouri lured Essegayer to New York City in the hope of developing leads. Essegayer asked el-Nouri to show him the sights, including Times Square.
He didn't see Times Square the way a foreigner would. He saw it as an opportunity to kill Americans.
An opportunity, Essegayer suggested, for a future New Year's Eve, when more than 100,000 people would fill the streets.
Multiple explosions that were timed about 5 to 10 seconds apart. As one went off, he thought about where the crowd would then run to, and that's where he wanted the next bomb to go off. Maximum carnage, maximum casualties.
He expected to get away with derailing the train so that he could go on to Times Square next.
Exactly. Shihab said that Al-Qaeda shifted gears. After 9/11, they lost some of their best minds. No more martyrdom. They didn't want to lose soldiers anymore, people with access to the West. So you do what you can, get out, hide, and do it again.
After his visit to Times Square, Essegier wanted to see where the Twin Towers had fallen.
And as he was rubbing his beard and his arm was around me, he said, "Tamer, this place needs another 9/11, and we're going to give it to him." I saw red at that moment. It was the hardest time in my career to stay professional. Here I am on hallowed ground, and he said that to me. At that very moment, I could feel a pen in the pocket of my jacket. I envisioned stabbing him in the eye and drop him dead right where he stood.
You very nearly blew your cover.
Yes, well, it's part of what we do, though. We pretend to be someone we loathe while hanging out with people we hate. Maybe it was the culmination of everything that was happening, the stress and pressure of identifying the sleeper, Shihab's rants about the West, whatever. But the point was, I almost broke that night, but thankfully for the case, I didn't.
The FBI wanted more time, but in April 2013, the Boston Marathon was attacked. And 1 week later, the Canadian government insisted on wrapping up its Al-Qaeda cell. Shihab Essegier and the accomplice on the bridge were tried, convicted, and sentenced to life. But the trail to the American sleeper, if he existed, went cold.
There hasn't been a day since April 22nd, 2013, when I've woken up, no matter where I am, that I don't think about the American sleeper.
Tamer El-Nouri's book, American Radical, was cleared for publication after an FBI review. The Bureau is keeping him out of action for a while to make sure that his identity isn't uncovered after the book and our interview.
Lin Vecchio was a highly decorated FBI agent who helped put some of the Mafia's most notorious leaders behind bars. He's also one of the few FBI agents ever charged with murder. It was his relationship with a violent mob informant known as the Grim Reaper that got him and the FBI in trouble. He's telling the story for the first time in a new book and to us tonight. It's rare to get an inside look at the shadowy world of informants and their handlers. It's rarer still to hear an FBI agent describe a brutal Mafia killer as his friend. But that is exactly what Lin Vecchio told us. He says his informant's information helped cripple the mob. To get it, however, Vecchio has been accused of making a deal with the devil.
I didn't make any bargains with the devil. I wasn't dancing with the devil. I was dancing with a guy that was very close to the devil. He was a tough guy, but that was what they were paying me to do. I got close to members of organized crime so we could eliminate them.
Do you feel like you walked up to the line?
Yeah. Yeah, sure, I got close to it. I freely admit that.
In the 1980s, the Mafia was a big problem in New York City, and this was as close as law enforcement often got. Surveillance footage taken outside a mob hangout called the Wimpy Boys Social Club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, an area then controlled by the Colombo family. One of the most notorious wise guys was Greg Scarpa, who had a reputation for brutality.
He was a made guy, a button in the Colombo family.
A tough guy, too.
Very tough. Was absolutely fearless, one of the toughest guys I've ever seen.
His toughness may have been legendary, but what no one in the Colombo family knew was that the Grim Reaper was also a rat. In the 1960s, he had secretly provided the FBI with detailed information about fellow mobsters, but he'd had a falling out with the Bureau and broke off relations. In 1980, Vecchio wanted Scarpa back, so he decided to take a big chance. He drove up to the gangster's home unannounced and blocked Scarpa's car as he was pulling out of his driveway.
You know, it was like, who the f are you? And I said, you know, I'd like to speak with you. I do need some help. You know, I want to get schooled in the life, you know, educate me. About 2 weeks later, he called. And he said, come alone. And I did.
FBI agents aren't supposed to meet alone with informants, but Vecchio got special permission. Scarpa was considered a top echelon informant, and great care was taken to keep their meetings secret. When law enforcement officials announced one of the most important prosecutions ever against the mob in 1985, very few people knew that Greg Scarpa's information had played a role. It was called the Commission Case.
This is a great day for law enforcement.
And it not only catapulted a young prosecutor named Rudy Giuliani into the limelight, it also sent the heads of 3 of the 5 crime families away for life. Vecchio got promoted and ended up leading 2 organized crime squads in New York. Greg Scarpa got paid $66,000 for the information he supplied over 12 years. And when he was arrested for credit card fraud, Vecchio helped keep him out of jail.
His career and his life and his milieu that he worked in was so different than mine that it was fascinating to me to learn about that. I like the guy. You know, I make no bones about that. I'm not ashamed of that. Doesn't mean I condone what he did.
It was a friendship.
It was a friendship, absolutely.
He was your friend.
He was.
But Greg Scarpa wasn't just a run-of-the-mill mobster. He was a stone-cold killer. He's believed to have murdered at least 12 people during the time he was an informant. Vecchio told us that on one occasion, Scarpa even let him know he'd killed another mobster.
There was a body found in Brooklyn one day. I said, who did the work?
Who did the murder?
Who killed him, yeah. And he smiled.
What did that smile tell you?
A smile told me he did it. He didn't tell me he did it, but I knew him well enough that, you know, he gave me that knowing look like, I did it, you know I did it, and I'm telling you I did it, but I'm not telling you I did it in words.
When he smiled and you thought, okay, it means he killed that guy, is that something you would investigate?
No, no. The guy was dead. I mean, as callous as that may sound, the person who's dead is not going to bring him back.
Ellen Corcella was a federal prosecutor who worked on cases with Lin Vecchio's squad.
You are absolutely not supposed to keep an informant on the street that is killing people.
Even if that person is giving you valuable information, which may have other arrests as a result of it?
And the question I would put to your question is, when is it valuable enough information that you let people continue to kill other people on the street?
In 1991, a war started between 2 rival factions of the Colombo family. Greg Scarpa is believed to have killed more people than anybody else. The whole time you're meeting with him during the war as an informant, he's also going around killing people.
Yes, he is. That's correct.
And did you know that at the time?
Sure. I knew that because I knew the guy he was.
But if you know the guy you're talking to stop the war is actually the guy who's conducting the war.
He wasn't the only one conducting the war. Everybody was shooting everybody.
I think that it became more valuable to him to have this informant on the street than it was to pursue other law enforcement goals.
So you think Vecchio was protecting Scarpa?
Yes.
Protecting him, she says, by giving Scarpa sensitive law enforcement information. Prosecutors first became suspicious when Scarpa's son, who was also involved in organized crime, went on the run just before he was going to be arrested. Those suspicions grew when some of Scarpa's crew got busted and started talking to authorities.
There was at least 2 of them that told us they had a source in law enforcement, and one of them basically was the guy who stayed at Scarpa's right hand. So he saw Scarpa go off and get phone calls and then come back and say, here's an address where I think we can find somebody to kill. I just got it from my source.
After hearing what Scarpa's associates had to say, 4 FBI agents accused their boss, Lin Vecchio, of leaking information to his informant, Greg Scarpa. One of the agents specifically remembered Vecchio asking for addresses that ended up in Scarpa's hands. And these were no ordinary addresses. They were the suspected hideouts of mobsters Greg Scarpa was trying to kill. Did you ever give Scarpa any law enforcement information?
Never. Never.
His son disappeared right on the eve of him about to be arrested by the DEA. Did you tip him off for that?
No, I did not. I went to him and asked him. I said, do you know where he is? He says, I don't know where he is, Lin. Was he lying to me? Maybe. But he looked me in the eye and said, I don't know where he is, Lin.
The FBI launched an internal investigation of Vecchio, which went on for years but came up with nothing. In 2006, however, the Brooklyn District Attorney charged Vecchio with murder, accusing him of telling Scarpa who to kill and where to find them. The Brooklyn District Attorney's case fell apart when a key witness was thoroughly discredited during the trial. Former FBI agents who supported Vecchio applauded as the charges were dismissed. But the judge who released Vecchio criticized him and the FBI for making a, quote, deal with the devil, letting Scarpa get away with his crimes for close to 15 years. Vecchio retired from the FBI in 1996 and now runs a private investigations business in Florida. He feels he's been wrongly accused and unfairly maligned, which is why he's written a book and is speaking to us.
We effectively broke the back of organized crime by using people such as Gregory Scarpa.
You basically gave this guy a pass because he was giving you good information.
If that's a perception that people have, so be it. I can't change their mind.
But is that the truth?
No, I don't think it's the truth at all.
You kept him out on the streets. A guy who you knew at the time was murdering people.
It's wonderful to sit in your ivory tower somewhere and say, oh, how can you do that? Well, why don't you go out in the street and try working that sometime? Try making a case. Try talking to a wise guy. Try getting that information.
Orange County, California, an hour south of Los Angeles, is best known for its wealthy, sprawling suburbs, Tony Beach communities, and Disneyland. But lately, it has drawn unwanted attention from the California Attorney General and the U.S. Department of Justice for the way its prosecutors use informants in its jails. Used correctly, informants can be valuable assets to law enforcement to help bolster their cases. Misused, their work can backfire, upsetting the scales of justice, reversing convictions, and freeing guilty criminals. That's what's happening in Orange County. This is a story of two snitches, one who remains in jail, the other is back on the streets. But now he's snitching on the prosecutors he once loyally served.
How many times were you arrested?
Numerous. Numerous.
5, 10, 15?
Over 100, let's say over 100.
Mark Cleveland is a career criminal. A life of drug addiction etches his face and gave him a rap sheet nearly as textured. 40 years of petty crimes, burglaries, a hit and run.
How are you out?
Because I'm extremely good at providing information to the Sheriff Department and the District Attorney's Office, and have been for years.
Cleveland was a jailhouse informant, a snitch. He ratted on other inmates in exchange for time off his sentence.
You were able to knock how much off your sentence?
Well, 40 years.
Because you were such a good informant?
Yeah.
We met Cleveland at a hotel. He keeps a low profile these days, fearful that former jailmates may seek retribution for betraying them. During his decades behind bars, Cleveland said he was willing to do almost anything law enforcement asked of him because he wanted out.
The problem is the desperation to get out and the willingness of the district attorney to use us. And the propensity for unreliability is huge. I mean, we want out of jail willing to do anything.
And willing to say anything.
And say anything, right.
Snitches will lie.
You know, snitches do lie every opportunity. If they need to, they will. It's about getting out of jail, and what do I have to do to get out of jail?
That's the end game for everybody.
Sure always has been.
Did you, Mark Cleveland, ever lie about information that you got from another inmate?
Give wrong information on another inmate. No, I'm sure that a lot of my information was probably maybe tainted.
Cleveland explains he was part of a sophisticated secret network of informants, tightly organized and directed by law enforcement inside the Orange County jails. He says it worked like this. Jail deputies would plant snitches like him near high-profile targets. Then, the deputies guided the snitches to fish for information that might help bolster the prosecutor's cases. Cleveland recalls one deputy asked him to target a member of the Mexican Mafia, a notorious gang that rules much of the prison turf in California.
He said, we want him on a murder. And if you could give us any information on that, I'll personally walk you out of the jails.
He told you he'd walk you out of the jail?
Yeah. And I said, well, I'm not in there with him. He said, we'll just move you and we'll put you right there with him.
For the most part, the people that you were informing on, was it a coincidence that you heard what they said, or were you placed there?
I was placed there. It's something that they do. He indicated it was something they do regularly.
What Cleveland is describing is unconstitutional. The integrity of the justice system is based on everybody following the rules. If an inmate just happens to hear and pass on incriminating information to prosecutors, that's okay. But inmates cannot be planted and directed to gather information from someone who's already been charged with a crime. If they do that, they are illegally acting as agents of law enforcement, which is exactly how Mark Cleveland saw himself.
What you see here in this briefcase is full of documents and copies of documents and notes and evidence of everything that I've done.
Cleveland showed us some of the meticulous handwritten copies of notes he sent to prosecutors, hundreds of pages on dozens of cases. And he said whenever he needed to, he could call the district attorney's office to report on his jailmates.
You had a direct line to the DA's office.
I could get on the phone anytime I want, night or day.
I thought you were limited on how many phone calls you could make.
Oh, you are, unless you're Mark Cleveland.
It sounds like you were working for the district attorney's office.
I was working right there with Tony. I would call him up, and he loved it. Every time I'd call him, oh, this is great. We really appreciate it.
Tony is Tony Rackauckus, the Orange County district attorney.
Mark Cleveland, do you know who he is? Does that ring a bell?
I do know who he is. I remember him having been an informant many years ago in a case or two, but my memory on that actually is not that clear.
Rackauckus is a former judge and a veteran prosecutor who has been reelected 4 times as district attorney. He commands an office of 275 lawyers who handle 15,000 felony cases a year. His office is now under investigation by both state and federal authorities for the way it uses and misuses informants in the county jails.
How should we take Mr. Cleveland's statements that he made to us about all this?
I think you should assume you're talking to an informant, and that if he's talking, he's probably lying.
But this idea that, he was part of this informant program and that he could just pick up the phone whenever he wanted and call the district attorney's office, you're saying it's not true. Fantasy.
It's fantasy.
He told us that he was deliberately placed by deputies in the jail next to inmates to get information. Is that true?
No, it is not true.
They deny. They basically say, we don't have an informant program. There's no organized informant program. This is just conspiracy theory on the part of the defense.
Assistant Public Defender Scott Sanders first uncovered the existence of a secret jailhouse informant program in Orange County. His suspicions peaked back in 2011, after one of the worst days in county history.
California Highway Patrol. Hey, we got some shootings over here in Seal Beach.
On a sparkling October afternoon, 41-year-old Scott Evans DeCry walked into a beauty salon and shot to death his ex-wife and 7 others. Minutes later, DeCry was arrested and quickly admitted his crime. DA Rackauckus called a press conference.
The only thing that might even approach justice in a case like this is for us to seek the death penalty.
Sanders, an assistant public defender for decades, was appointed to represent accused killer Scott DeCry. A tough job made even tougher when he learned his client had confessed to another snitch in the Orange County Jail. Named only as Inmate F, the prosecutors tried to keep the informant's true identity hidden, arguing they needed to protect him. After months of relentless digging, Sanders finally learned Inmate F was Fernando Perez, a well-documented, prolific snitch.
The representations they made was that Fernando Perez was just a good citizen who was looking for nothing in return, didn't want anything, and was just basically doing this out of the goodness of his heart.
And you found out he was a Mexican mafia gang leader and had 3 strikes against him and was desperate to reduce time off of his sentence.
He had already been convicted. He was looking at a 25 to life sentence. So he had all the incentive in the world to do every last thing he could do to gain favor with the prosecution.
Something Sanders had seen before. Another one of his clients, also accused of murder, also facing the death penalty, also just happened to confess to Fernando Perez.
I was stunned. I mean, it was one of those moments where you kind of just look up and go, what's going on here? And that's really kind of the starting point. That realization was kind of what propelled us forward.
In voluminous court documents, Sanders, a zealous opponent of the death penalty, accused the district attorney's office and sheriff's department of illegally planting Perez in the cell next to DeCry, then trying to cover it up. They hid Perez's long resume as an informant.
Was Fernando Perez deliberately placed next to DeCry in a jail cell?
Fernando Perez was not deliberately placed next to DeCry in the Orange County Jail. DeCry was put there on a nurse's order, and Fernando Perez had already been there.
It seems from the outside like a hell of a coincidence that this guy who's a well-known and valuable informant is placed next to this high-profile target. But you're saying it was just that. It was just a coincidence.
It was just a coincidence.
Scott Sanders says an amazing coincidence in a jail with 6,000 inmates. D.A. Rackauckus insisted there was no jailhouse informant program. When Mark Cleveland heard that, he called Assistant Public Defender Scott Sanders and went back to his old job of snitching. But this time he began informing on the prosecutors he once served.
What did he tell you about how the jailhouse informant program works?
He said we were onto something really bad, and then he started to describe things in details, and the details made sense.
What did he tell you that you didn't know?
We were really looking at a relatively small time period. And here comes Mark Cleveland and says, no, it's been going on for years. Let me take you back to the cases.
It's simply not the case. That's just not who we are. We prosecute cases in a fair and ethical manner.
How often does your office use jailhouse informants?
Not very often. The informants are not the most reliable people around. They're, in fact, unreliable, and everybody knows that.
Which is why Cleveland says he and many other inmates gathering information were rarely called to testify.
So if you weren't testifying, what were they doing with all the information?
They were getting plea bargains on them. Rather than put me on the stand.
They didn't want to put you on the stand?
No, they didn't want to put me on the stand. They don't want to put any informant on the stand.
Tony Rackauckus argued his prosecutors never intended to put Fernando Perez on the stand either. But they did want to hear what Scott DeCry told Perez about the murders. Prosecutors worried DeCry might plead insanity to avoid the death penalty, so they placed a bug in his cell and started recording as Perez pumped him for details.
It's not a bad thing to get evidence that would tend to rebut an insanity defense, so that a jury could hear him describing the murders and why he did it and what he did.
But the judge threw out the confession. He said Perez was acting as an agent of law enforcement when he egged on DeCry to tell him about the killings. A failed ploy that has delayed justice for the families of Scott DeCry's victims for years in what should have been a slam-dunk case.
You had a great case with DeCry. You had confessions, you had witnesses, you had motive. Why risk it and use somebody like Fernando Perez as part of your case?
Well, look, we had a really good case, no question about it. When you listen to what it was that he had to say to Perez, it was a very clear statement of what it was he was doing, his intent, his malice, his reasons.
Under mounting public and political pressure, the district attorney appointed a blue ribbon panel to look into what happened.
They described the office as a must-win mentality. They described your office as a ship without a rudder. They said there's been a failure of leadership.
You know, it's interesting, they did say those things, and they put that in the writing. But I talked to them personally, and they really didn't have that to say personally. It's getting around that there's some kind of a conspiracy or there's some kind of willingness to violate people's rights or to not give people a fair trial. That's a false narrative. That's simply not true.
Okay, so clarify it for me.
So the public defender made a lot of allegations of all kinds of criminal conduct, of terrible things. And believe me, and if those things were true, we should be in jail, frankly. If those things were true, that would be very bad.
But what about the allegation that the office withheld evidence?
The office did not withhold evidence. We have not withheld any evidence.
He told us that even after the judge disagreed. The judge ruled jail deputies working for the DA's office intentionally lied or willfully withheld material evidence about the secret informant program. The judge went on to say that even if the prosecutors didn't know the deputies were hiding evidence, they should have. And then the judge went even further. Convinced Decry could not get a fair trial from Orange County prosecutors, he kicked the entire office, all 275 of them, off the case. Decry still hasn't been sentenced, and the informant debacle has led to the unraveling of a half-dozen cases, putting murderers and thugs back on the street. As for Fernando Perez, inmate F, his snitching paid off. Instead of a life in prison, a judge sentenced him to spend another few years in protective custody, and then he'll be released as a reward for all his snitching.
Tonight, we're going to tell you a story you've probably never heard before because only a few people outside the FBI know anything about it. It's a spy story unlike any other. And if you think your life is complicated, wait till you hear about Jack Barsky's, who led 3 of them simultaneously. 1 as a husband and father, 2 as a computer programmer and administrator at some top American corporations, and 3 as a KGB agent spying on America during the last decade of the Cold War. The FBI did finally apprehend him in Pennsylvania, but it was long after the Soviet Union had crumbled. What makes Jack Barsky's story even more remarkable is he's never spent a night in jail. The Russians declared him dead a long time ago. He's living a quiet life in upstate New York and has worked in important and sensitive jobs. He's now free to tell his story as honestly as a former spy ever can.
So who are you?
Who am I? That depends when the question is asked. Right now, I'm Jack Barsky. I work in the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen, but it wasn't always the case.
How many different identities do you have?
I have 2 main identities, a German one and an American one.
What's your real name?
My real name is Jack Barsky.
What name were you born with?
Albrecht Dittrich. Say that 3 times real fast.
Just say it once slowly.
Albrecht Dittrich.
How Albrecht Dietrich became Jack Barsky is one of the untold stories of the Cold War, an era when the real battles were often fought between the CIA and the KGB. Barsky was a rarity, a Soviet spy who posed as an American and became enmeshed in American society. For the 10 years he was operational for the KGB, no one in this country knew his real story, not even his family.
Did you think you were going to get away with this?
Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't have done it.
What Barsky did can be traced back to East Germany, back to the days when he was Albrecht Dietrich. A national scholar at a renowned university in Jena, Dietrich was on the fast track to becoming a chemistry professor, his dream job.
Didn't work out that way because I was recruited by the KGB to do something a little more adventurous.
Spy.
We called it something different. We used a euphemism. I was going to be a scout for peace.
A KGB scout for peace.
That is correct. The communist spies were the good guys and the capitalist spies were the evil ones, so we didn't use the word spy.
He says his spying career began with a knock on his dorm room door one Saturday afternoon in 1970. A man introduced himself, claiming to be from a prominent optics company.
He wanted to talk with me about my career, which was highly unusual. There was a flash in my head and said, that's Stasi.
East German Secret Police.
East German Secret Police, yeah.
It was a Stasi agent. He invited Dietrich to this restaurant in Jena, where a Russian KGB agent showed up and took over the conversation. The KGB liked Dietrich's potential because he was smart, his father was a member of the Communist Party, and he didn't have any relatives in the West. Dietrich liked the attention and the notion he might get to help the Soviets.
And what did you think of America?
It was the enemy. And the reason that the Americans did so well was because they exploited all the third world countries. That's what we were taught and that's what we believed. We didn't know any better. I grew up in an area where you could not receive West German television. It was called the Valley of the Clueless.
For the next couple of years, the KGB put Dietrich through elaborate tests, and then in 1973, he was summoned to East Berlin to this former Soviet military compound. The KGB, he says, wanted him to go undercover.
At that point, I had passed all the tests, so they made me an offer.
But you've been thinking about it all along, haven't you?
That's true. With one counterweight, in that you didn't really know what was going to come. Is how do you test drive becoming another person?
It was a difficult decision, but he agreed to join the KGB and eventually found himself in Moscow undergoing intensive training.
A very large part of the training was operational work, determination as to whether you're being under surveillance, Morse code, shortwave radio reception. I also learned how to do microdots. A microdot is, you take a picture and make it so small with the use of a microscope that you can put it under a postage stamp.
The Soviets were looking to send someone to the U.S. who could pose as an American. Dietrich showed a command of English and no trace of an East German accent that might give him away. He learned 100 new English words every day.
It took me forever. I did probably a full year of phonetics training. The difference between hot and hut, right? That's very difficult, and most Germans don't get that one.
Did you want to go to the United States?
Oh, yeah. Sure. It was New York, to San Francisco, we heard about these places.
Your horizons were expanding.
Oh, absolutely. Now I'm really in the big league, right?
Dietrich needed an American identity. And one day, a diplomat out of the Soviet embassy in Washington came across this tombstone just outside of D.C. with the name of a 10-year-old boy who had died in 1955. The name was Jack Philip Barsky.
And they said, guess what, we have a birth certificate, you're going to the U.S.
And that was the Jack Barsky birth certificate?
The Jack Barsky birth certificate that somebody had obtained and I was given. I didn't have to get this myself.
Did you feel strange walking around with this identity of a child?
No. No. When you do this kind of work, some things you don't think about. Because if you explore, you may find something you don't like.
The newly minted Jack Barsky landed in New York City in the fall of 1978 with a phony backstory called a legend and a fake Canadian passport that he quickly discarded. The KGB's plan for him was fairly straightforward. They wanted the 29-year-old East German to get a real U.S. passport with his new name, then become a businessman, then insert himself into the upper echelons of American society, and then to get close to National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski so that he could spy on him.
That was the plan. It failed.
Why?
Because I was not given very good instructions with regard to how to apply for a passport.
When he went to apply for a passport at Rockefeller Center, Barsky was thrown off by the list of questions.
Specific details about my past for which I had no proof, so I walked out of it.
Did the KGB have a pretty good grasp on the United States and how things worked there?
No.
No?
Absolutely not. They made a number of mistakes in terms of giving me advice what to do, what not to do. They just didn't know.
Left to fend for himself in a country the KGB didn't understand, he got himself a cheap apartment and tried to make do with the birth certificate and $6,000 in cash the Soviets had given him. His spying career at that point more resembled the bumbling Boris Badenov than James Bond.
So you were working as a bike messenger?
Right.
That doesn't sound like a promising position for a spy.
No, but there were a lot of things that I didn't know.
So how close did you ever get to Brzezinski?
Not very.
To get a Social Security card, which he would need if he wanted a real job, Barsky knew he would have to do some acting.
It was unusual for a 30-plus-year-old person to say, I don't have a Social Security card, give me one. So in order to make my story stick, I made my face dirty, so I looked like somebody who just came off a farm. It worked. The lady asked me, she said, so how come you don't have a card? And when the answer was, I didn't need one. Why? Well, I worked on a farm. And that was the end of the interview.
The Social Security card enabled him to enroll at Baruch College in Manhattan, where he majored in computer systems. He was class valedictorian, but you won't find a picture of him in the school yearbook. In 1984, he was hired as a programmer by Metropolitan Life Insurance, where he had access to the personal information of millions of Americans.
You were writing computer code?
Right, yes. Lots of it, and I was really good at it.
What he didn't write, he stole on behalf of the KGB.
What was the most valuable piece of information you gave them?
I would say that that was the computer code, because that was a very prominent piece of industrial software, still in use today.
This was IBM code?
No comment.
You don't want to say?
No. It was good stuff. Let's put it this way, yeah.
It was helpful to the Soviet Union.
It would have been helpful to the Soviet Union and their running organizations and factories and so forth.
How often did you communicate with the Russians?
I would get a radiogram once a week.
A radiogram meaning?
A radiogram means a transmission that was on a certain frequency at a certain time.
Every Thursday night at 9:15, Barsky would tune into his shortwave radio at his apartment in Queens and listen for a transmission he believed came from Cuba.
All the messages were encrypted, that they became digits. And the digits would be sent over as in groups of 5. And sometimes that took a good hour to just write it all down, and another 3 hours to decipher.
During the 10 years he worked for the KGB, Barsky had a ready-made cover story.
When somebody asks you, where are you from, Jack? What did you say?
I'm originally from New Jersey. I was born in Orange. That's it, American. Nobody ever questioned that. People would question you have an accent. But my comeback was, yeah, my mother was German, and we spoke a lot of German at home.
You had to tell a lot of lies.
Absolutely. I was living a lie.
Were you a good liar?
The best.
You had to be a good liar to juggle the multiple lives he was leading. Every 2 years, while he was undercover for the KGB, Barsky would return to East Germany and Moscow for debriefings. During one of his visits to East Berlin, he married his old girlfriend, Gerlinde, and they had a son.
Did that complicate matters?
Initially, it wasn't complicated at all. It got complicated later.
Because?
Because I got married in the United States to somebody else.
Did she know about your other wife in Germany?
No.
Did your wife in Germany know about the...
Not at all.
So you had 2 wives?
I did. I was officially a bigamist. That's the one thing I am so totally not proud of.
Being a spy was all right. Being a bigamist?
In hindsight, I was a spy for the wrong people, but this one hurt, because I had promised my German wife that, we would be together forever, and I broke that promise. And the one way I can explain that to myself is I had separated the Dietrich from the Barsky to the point where the two just didn't know about each other.
Not only did he have 2 different identities and 2 wives, he had a son named Matthias in Germany and a daughter named Chelsea in America. And by November 1988, a radiogram from the KGB would force him to make an excruciating choice.
I received a radiogram that essentially said, you need to come home. Your cover may soon be broken, and you are in danger of being arrested by the American authorities.
Barsky was given urgent instructions from the KGB to locate an oil can that had been dropped next to a fallen tree just off this path on New York's Staten Island. A fake passport and cash that he needed to escape the United States and return to East Germany would be concealed inside the can.
I was supposed to pick up the container and go on, leave.
Right.
Not even go back home to the apartment, just disappear. The container wasn't there. I don't know what I would have done if I had found it, but I know what I did when I didn't find it. I did not tell them, repeat the operation. I made the decision to stay.
Why?
Because of Chelsea.
Your daughter?
Yes. If Chelsea is not in the mix, it's a no-brainer. I'm out of here.
Barsky had chosen Chelsea over Matthias.
I had bonded with her. It was a tough one, because on the one hand, I had a wife and a child in Germany, but if I don't take care of Chelsea, she grows up in poverty.
This may be a little harsh, but it sounds like the first time in your life that you thought about somebody besides yourself.
You're absolutely right. I was quite an egomaniac. I was.
Jack Barsky was still left with the not insignificant matter of telling the KGB that he was staying in America. In a moment, we'll tell you how he duped the KGB and how the FBI changed his life. At the end of 1988, Jack Barsky's 10-year run as a clandestine KGB agent in the United States was about to come to an end. He had ignored Soviet warnings that his cover had been blown and decided to remain in America and not return to his native East Germany. He was taking a chance that no one in America would ever find out who he really was, and he was taking a bigger chance that the KGB wouldn't retaliate for disobeying an order. The urgency with which the Soviets seemed to view the situation became clear one morning in Queens. Jack Barsky says he was on his way to work in December 1988, standing and waiting for an A train on this subway platform when a stranger paid him a visit.
There's this character in a black coat, and he sidles up to me and he whispers in my ear, says, "You gotta come home or else you're dead." And then he walked out.
Russian accent?
Yes.
That's an incentive.
It's an incentive to go.
I mean, spies get killed all the time.
They do, but not me. The entire time, I always had this childlike belief that everything would be all right.
So what are you going to tell the Russians?
Well, I sent them this Dear John letter, the goodbye letter, in which I stated that I had contracted AIDS, and that the only way for me to get a treatment would be in the United States.
You just wrote them a letter and said, "I can't come back, I've got AIDS"?
There's three things I tell people that the Russians were afraid of. AIDS, Jewish people, and Ronald Reagan. And they were definitely...
In that order?
I think Ronald Reagan took the top spot. They thought he would push the button.
The AIDS letter apparently worked because in East Berlin, the Soviets told his German wife Gerlinde he wasn't coming back.
They went to Gerlinde and told her that I had died of AIDS. So I think they just wrote me off completely.
You were officially dead in East Germany?
After 5 years, she was able to declare me as dead.
Once the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart, Barsky was a man without a country. No one would want him back. He felt his secret was safe in America. He became a family guy with a wife, 2 kids, Chelsea and Jesse, and a job. He burrowed himself into suburbia, keeping a low profile.
I was settling down. I was living in rural Pennsylvania at the time, in a nice house with 2 children. It was like typical middle-class existence.
And his life would have stayed quiet if a KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin hadn't defected to the West in 1992 with a trove of notes on the Soviet spying operations around the world. Buried deep in his papers was the last name of a secret agent the KGB had deployed somewhere in America, Barsky.
We were concerned that he might be running an agent operating in the federal government somewhere. Who knows, in the FBI, the CIA, the State Department. We had no idea.
Joe Riley was an FBI agent when the Bureau got the Mitrokhin tip, and the Barsky case quickly became serious enough that FBI Director Louis Freeh got personally involved. The FBI didn't know who or where he was, but the best lead seemed to be a Jack Barsky who was working as an IT specialist in New Jersey with a suburban home across the border in Mount Bethel, Pennsylvania.
Aside from his name, was there anything else that made you suspicious and make you think that this was the guy you were looking for?
Yes. One thing was the fact that he had applied for a Social Security number late in life, especially someone like him who was educated and intelligent.
The FBI began following Barsky, and when this surveillance photo caught him talking to a native of Cuba, the Bureau grew increasingly concerned.
There were some indications that I could possibly be the head of an international spy ring, because I had a friend who was originally from Cuba. And it so happened that this friend owned an apartment that was rented to a Soviet diplomat. So that one raised all kinds of flags, and they investigated me very, very, very carefully.
FBI agent Joe Riley went so far as to set up an observation post on a hillside behind Barsky's house. This is a picture he took of his view.
I got a telescope and binoculars as if I was a bird watcher, but I was looking at his backyard and at him. over time, I learned a great deal about him.
Like what?
Just watching him. Well, I became convinced that he loved his children. And that was important because I wanted to know if he would flee. There was less chance of that if he was devoted to his children, and he was.
But that wasn't enough for the FBI. The Bureau bought the house next door to get a closer look at the Barskys.
Did you get a good deal?
I think we paid what he was asking. And we had agents living there so that we could be sure who was coming and going from his house without being too obvious in our surveillance.
You had no idea the FBI was living next door to you?
No.
Never saw
no.
Joe Riley up on the hill with the binoculars?
Absolutely not.
When the FBI finally got authorization from the Justice Department to bug Barsky's home, the case broke wide open.
Within, I'd say, the first 2 weeks that we had microphones in his house, he had an argument with his wife in the kitchen. And during the course of that dispute, he readily admitted that he was an agent operating from the Soviet Union.
It was all the FBI needed to move in on Barsky. They set a trap for him at a toll bridge across the Delaware River as he drove home from work late one Friday afternoon in May of 1997.
I'm being waved to the side by a state trooper. And he said, we're doing a routine traffic check. Would you please get out of the car? I get out of the car. And somebody steps up from behind and shows me a badge. And he said, FBI, we would like to talk to you.
His face just dropped. And we told him that he had to go with us.
The first words out of my mouth were, am I under arrest? And the answer was no. Now that took a big weight off of me, so I figured there was a chance to get out of this in one piece. And the next question I asked, so what took you so long?
The FBI had rented an entire wing of a motel off Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania for Barsky's interrogation.
But on the way to the motel, I remember turning to him and I told him that this didn't have to be the worst day of his life. And he immediately realized that he had an out.
I said to them, listen, I know I have only one shot out of this, and that means I need to come clean and be 100% honest and tell you everything I know.
The FBI questioned Barsky throughout the weekend and gave him a polygraph test that he passed. Convinced that his spying days were over and that his friendship with the Cuban was just that, the FBI decided to keep the whole thing quiet and allowed Barsky to go back to work on Monday morning.
Was he charged with something?
No.
Even though he had confessed to being a Soviet spy?
Yes.
That seems odd.
Well, we wanted him to cooperate with us. We didn't want to put him in jail. He was no use to us there.
Barsky continued to meet not only with the FBI, but with the National Security Agency to offer his first-hand insights into the KGB and the Russians.
I was able to provide him with a lot of valuable information how the KGB operated.
The only people who were aware of his secret were the FBI and Penelope, his wife in America, who subsequently filed for divorce. His daughter, Chelsea, then a teenager, knew only that he wanted to tell her something when she turned 18. That day finally arrived on a 4-hour drive to St. Francis University.
He started chuckling to himself and he said, well, I was a spy. I was a KGB spy. I was like, what? Really?
Jack also revealed to Chelsea why he had decided to stay in America.
He said that, he fell in love with me and my curls when I was a little baby, and then I cried.
Did he tell you everything?
No, he didn't. He didn't tell me 100% the whole truth. He left some things out at that point.
I told her everything that you can tell in 4 hours that is age appropriate. She was still a teenager. I may not have told her that I was married in Germany.
He waited another 2 years before he matter-of-factly dropped another bombshell about his past.
He just looked straight ahead at the TV and he said, did I tell you you have a brother? And I turned my head, I'm like, what? Are you serious?
The half-brother was Matthias, the boy Jack had left behind in Germany. Chelsea was determined to find him. Jack didn't like the idea.
I did not feel comfortable getting in touch with him. I did not feel comfortable with my acknowledging my German past.
After a year of trying to track him down online, Chelsea finally got a reply from Matthias.
The subject line said, "Dear little sister." And when I saw "Dear little sister," I just started weeping because that meant everything to me. That meant that he accepted me.
And this is me.
A month later, Matthias was in Pennsylvania visiting Chelsea and her brother Jesse. They hit it off. Matthias wasn't interested in seeing his father, then changed his mind.
Was it awkward?
I just remember he stared at me for a couple of minutes. He just stared at me.
I mean, he had reason to be angry with you.
When I told him the dilemma that I was faced with, he actually said, "I understand."
And what's your relationship like with Matthias now?
He feels like he is my son.
Gerlinda, the wife in Germany who thought he was dead, wants nothing to do with Jack today or with 60 Minutes. He has remarried and has a 4-year-old daughter. They live in upstate New York, where Jack has worked as director of software development for a company that manages New York's high-voltage power grid, a critical piece of U.S. infrastructure. When he told his employer recently that he had once been a KGB spy, he was placed on a paid leave of absence. Before becoming an American citizen last year, he had been given a clean bill of health by the FBI and U.S. intelligence agencies. But in the world of espionage, it's often difficult to tell what's true and what's legend.
Are you telling the truth right now?
I am, absolutely. The truth as far as I know it, yes.
As far as you know it?
Well, you know, sometimes memory fails, but I am absolutely not holding back anything.
Why tell the story now?
I want to meet my maker clean. I need to get clean with the past. I need to digest this fully. All right, take your mulligan already.
The FBI agent who apprehended him, Joe Riley, still believes in Barsky, and in yet another twist to the story, the two are good friends and golfing buddies.
He's a very honest person. And if you want to find out how honest someone is, play golf with them.
But you're a former FBI guy and he's a former spy.
Yeah.
What's the bond?
It's personal. He credits me for keeping him out of prison.
After nearly 30 years, Jack Barsky went back to visit a unified Germany, first in October, then again last month.
So that was essentially the very beginning of my career.
He showed his kids where this improbable tale began and some other key settings in his odyssey. And he caught up with old classmates who knew him as Albrecht Dietrich.
When you're here in Germany,
yeah.
Are you Albrecht or are you Jack?
No, I'm Jack. I am 100% Jack. You know, I let the Albrecht out, and sometimes he interferes, but they get along very well now.
The Berlin Wall, which once divided East and West, is now gone, except for a section that has been turned into an art display. Checkpoint Charlie, once the epicenter of the Cold War, is now a tourist attraction, full of kitsch. Statues of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels still stand in the eastern part of Berlin, relics of another era, as is the man who straddled two worlds and got away with it.
There's no question Bryant Venus betrayed America. What you'll have to decide for yourself is whether he's done enough to atone for his crimes. The New York City man, raised Catholic on Long Island, joined Al-Qaeda in 2008. But after he was caught, Venus became an informant, cooperating with the FBI. Today, U.S. prosecutors say Bryant Venus may have been the most valuable witness ever in the war on Al-Qaeda. Venus impressed prosecutors and the judge in his case so much that they prepared to shield him from the prospect of Al-Qaeda's revenge by putting him in the Federal Witness Protection Program. All was prepared until Bryant Venus says he was double-crossed. You can assume that Al-Qaeda wants to kill you.
Yes.
Right now, today.
Yes.
Why be on television?
To let people know what went wrong.
Life went wrong for Bryant Venus at an early age. He was a troubled teenager. His mother kicked him out. Venus was searching for purpose and converted to Islam. Later, He was seduced by the online fanaticism of Al-Qaeda recruiter Anwar al-Awlaki.
We are fighting for a noble cause. We are fighting for God.
Al-Awlaki was an American, killed back in 2011 by a U.S. drone.
A lot of his sermons very captivating, very mesmerizing, I guess you could say. He was talking about the injustices in the world, oppression going on in the Middle East, and it hit me in my heart.
And you decided that the problems in the Middle East were your problems.
It was a problem that I could get involved in, yes.
In 2007, at the age of 24, Venus journeyed to Pakistan and Afghanistan. You wanted to kill Americans.
At the time, yes.
Venus found himself welcomed by terrorists who had longed for an American recruit who traveled on a U.S. passport.
I asked somebody, I was like, what group is this? And he says, no, this is Al-Qaeda. I said, this is Al-Qaeda? And he says, yeah. I'm like, this is not what you see in the videos. This is not what you see on the news.
What do you mean?
Usually you see monkey bars where guys are training or crawling underneath barbed wire, and I didn't do any of that. That's not how it was when I was there.
What type of training did you get in this Al-Qaeda camp?
Okay, so we did basic Soviet weapons. They go a little bit into explosive theory, suicide bombing vests.
Venus says a high-ranking Al-Qaeda leader asked him for advice on possible targets in the U.S.
I gave information on the Long Island Railroad, a plot on how to attack it. Basically the tunnel that connects all the trains that lead into Manhattan. So if the tunnel is destroyed, then it would hurt the economy in New York.
They wanted to attack the economy of the United States.
Yes, sir. The death toll isn't really the primary target.
They'd probably never heard of the Long Island Railroad before. You might have relatives or friends on the railroad.
Yeah, very possible, yeah.
How do you feel about that now?
Regretful. Actually, I'm very thankful nobody got hurt. And it was in the idea stages, and that's as far as it went.
Did you take part on any attacks on U.S. bases in Afghanistan?
Yes, sir. I was part of a defensive team to protect the group that was launching the rockets.
What was your job?
In case a Pakistani helicopter came, we were supposed to attack that helicopter so it wouldn't attack the group down below.
In 2008, after 7 months in terrorist camps, Venus took a short break to visit the city of Peshawar. Apparently, the Pakistanis were watching. He was arrested, turned over to the United States, and within days found himself in federal prison in Brooklyn. There, FBI agents offered him a choice: life in prison or tell all about Al-Qaeda. To help convince him, agents took him to Coney Island. They took you to Nathan's hot dog stand?
Well, I was in the car, and then one detective went and got an order, brought it back.
And brought you a hot dog?
Hot dogs, burgers, fries, drink.
And they showed you around Coney Island, and they said, you can have a life again.
Yes. He holds out his arms. He says, you really want to go back to prison and go to Supermax for the rest of your life? And I said, you know what, this is my chance to get a second chance at life. And I said, you know what, I'll take it.
So Venus decided to plead guilty. His sentencing was postponed until the government could assess the quality of his cooperation. Confined to prison, Venus spent 8 years, meeting more than 100 times with prosecutors and the FBI.
Venus changed the way we thought about how Al-Qaeda recruits and who Al-Qaeda recruits.
Andrew McCabe was the head of FBI counterterrorism and oversaw the Venus case. This was before McCabe became better known for opening 2 investigations of President Trump. How valuable was Bryant Venus to the FBI?
Incredibly valuable. Through his testimony, through his debriefings, identifying people, teaching us how he had walked this pathway from Long Island, New York, into Al-Qaeda.
You didn't know that stuff before?
Learning about his experience completely broke the mold from the way that we thought business was happening. Prior to Venus, the idea that any American could just head to Pakistan and go seek out Al-Qaeda and affiliate with that group was something we thought couldn't be done.
He was a game changer for the FBI in terms of Al-Qaeda?
I would say so, yes.
His information has
stopped more attacks than you can even conceive of.
Steve Zissou is a defense lawyer with a top security clearance. He's represented several terrorism suspects, including Bryant Venus.
I have reviewed both classified and unclassified information, and the government's submissions to the court make it unequivocally clear that his information stopped attacks, saved lives, and permitted our military to continue the battle, to take it to them, if you will.
Were drone strikes launched on the basis of his information?
No doubt about it.
Venus's defense attorney points to drone strikes that killed 14 suspected jihadists where Venus had lived.
So they were killing these people who used to be your friends?
Yes, sir.
How did you feel about that?
At one time they were my friends, but you know, if I have to leave that life behind, I can't have them be my friends no more.
In 2017, prosecutors wrote this to the judge in Venus's case, Nicholas Garifas. To say that the defendant provided substantial assistance to the government is an understatement. Indeed, he may have been the single most valuable cooperating witness with respect to Al-Qaeda. Judge Garifas agreed, adding that Venus had placed his life in grave danger to help his country.
He was the extraordinary case. Mr. Venus has certain God-given gifts, one of which is that he has a photographic memory. He remembered every place he had been. He remembered most of the people he had met. He was able to explain to the government how Al-Qaeda recruits. That's why he was so valuable.
With that in mind, Judge Garifas ruled that the 8 years Venus had spent cooperating from a prison cell were enough.
The sentence was time served with an additional 90 days.
Why 90 days?
In order for him to have the opportunity to be placed in witness protection once he's released.
So it was your understanding that he was going to be brought into the witness protection program?
Yes, it absolutely was.
And what happened?
So on the 88th day of the 90-day period, I was advised that he had been refused a witness protection status by this office at the Justice Department, the Office of Enforcement Operations. There had never been a problem before in any of my cases involving cooperators who sought witness protection.
In prison, Venus already had been in witness protection. Judge Garifas told us it's routine for the same protection to continue after release. But the U.S. Department of Justice Witness Security Program, known as WITSEC, turned him down with no explanation.
They don't give the reasons, and the prosecutors moved for reconsideration. Reconsideration was denied.
The prosecutors work for the Justice Department. The FBI agents are part of the Justice Department. All of them agree that he should be in the witness protection program, and then another agency inside the Justice Department overrules them?
That's what troubles me, that they've had 8,700, at least 8,700 cooperators placed in witness protection. And I know some of these cooperators. They've been my defendants. I've had virtually the entire Banana organized crime family on my docket. I've had many trials involving murderers and drug kingpins on my docket. So I'm not a newcomer to this process. And I was shocked that they took such a cavalier, irresponsible step as they did to deny Mr. Venus witness protection.
The Justice Department's WITSEC office declined an interview, but in a statement to 60 Minutes, it hinted at an explanation. It singled out just one of the factors in its decision process. WITSEC must take into account the risks associated with giving a person a new identity and placing them in a community that is unaware of the person's actual identity. Judge Garifas argues that if Venus does pose a continuing risk to the community, then witness protection would ensure that the government kept tabs on him. And after all Venus has done, Garifas says, The Justice Department has an obligation to keep him safe.
It's extremely rare, Your Honor, in my experience, to have a federal judge talk about a case. And I wonder why you have done this today.
I've never done it before in 18 years as a judge. I won't allow the folks who made this decision to hide behind their decision. And it's a potential problem in the future.
This would have a chilling effect, in your opinion, on people who might consider cooperating in the future.
That's right.
Today, Bryant Venus is on his own.
Right now, I'm working washing dishes at a restaurant, so that's how I'm paying the bills.
The greatest Al-Qaeda informant of all time, we're told, is washing dishes.
That's correct.
You're probably the only dishwasher who lectures at West Point.
Yeah.
After 8 years in prison cooperating with the government, Venus is still fighting terror. He's spoken at the U.S. Military Academy and to research organizations about the false lure of jihad. And he's still helping investigators.
Do you consider yourself, as we sit here right now,
yes,
square with the United States?
I always feel that it's a continuing process that I should do for years to come.
I don't forgive him for seeking to engage in jihad against the United States. It's not that you forgive him, but he turned a corner and he was successful in doing it. The government needs to meet its part of the bargain.
Everyone who knew him at the FBI thought Robert Hanssen was a quiet, unassuming computer nerd. But it turns out this FBI agent gave away more secrets than any spy in the history of the Bureau. For $600,000 in cash and diamonds from the Russians, Hanssen compromised, among other things, the existence of a top-secret surveillance tunnel under the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., secret U.S. war plans, and the identity of Russians working as spies for the U.S. For over 22 years, he went undetected as he worked his way up to chief of the Soviet Analytical Unit, which has been described as a supermarket of classified information on U.S. operations against the Russians. What's more, he not only betrayed his country, he also betrayed his church and his wife in an almost unimaginable way.
Betrayal was at the very core of his soul.
Pulitzer Prize-winning author Norman Mailer and filmmaker Lawrence Schiller have spent the last 10 months investigating the Hanssen case for an upcoming CBS television movie and a book called Into the Mirror. Here he is with one of his sons.
Teaching him how to shoot. James Bond.
For their research, Schiller and Mailer have gone through a family album that depicts an image of your normal, healthy, middle-class, all-American family man. Now, this is the picture of them getting married. Look how happy he is.
And he's tall and handsome, and she looks like Natalie Wood. This is the perfect couple.
Here's the whole family. Look at that, just gorgeous.
All 6 members of his family.
By all outward appearances, Hanssen was devoted to his kids and Bonnie, his wife of 33 years. They sent their children to private religious schools so they could be instilled with solid Christian values. But this was all an illusion. Bob Hanssen wasn't just a double agent. He had multiple secret lives at the office and at home.
Just right after being married, he started to photograph his wife. He started taking pictures of her, nude pictures, a little more risque, pretty strong pictures.
That may not sound all that strange, but what was even stranger was that he was sending those nude pictures, unbeknownst to his wife, to his best friend, now retired U.S. Army officer Jack Horshauer. And if that's not enough, Hanssen showed his best friend even more.
He had immense knowledge of technology, so he was able to put a closed-circuit television camera in his bedroom, hidden away behind a photograph with a little hole in the photograph, and it was piped into a television set someplace else in the house. And when Jack Horshauer would visit, he'd say, just turn on the television, and if you want to watch something interesting, let me know. And he would watch Robert Hanssen making love to his wife. His wife didn't know about
You're
this.
telling this in the most matter-of-fact tone of voice, as if, hey, he set up a camera and let his friend watch him in bed with his wife.
But
this is over the top.
It's not only over the top, but then he would ask Jack Hirschauer, well, would you like to see me do something else in bed? What else would you like?
What do you call that?
I call it wicked to the nth degree.
And there's even more. Incredible as it sounds, Hanssen published stories about his sexual life with his wife on adult-oriented websites and used his own name.
He lived a life of treachery and betrayal, and he betrayed everyone.
Nobody knows more about spies and their peccadillos than John Martin. He oversaw the investigations and prosecutions of some 76 spies when he was a senior official at the Justice Department. Out of government now, he has followed the Hanssen case closely. Do you know that Hanssen wrote pornographic stories on the internet?
I did not know that until recently.
If the Bureau had found out about that, would that have rung any bell?
He would have been removed from access, and an investigation would have been conducted.
Now, he used his own name and the name of his wife. How come that wasn't caught? They just weren't looking, or?
I don't know if the FBI is surfing the pornographic net looking for spies. They may be doing it after this case.
Hanssen began feeding the Soviets valuable information in 1979, just 3 years after joining the FBI. He communicated with the Russians in writing. This is a copy of one of his actual letters sent in 1985 to his handler, Viktor Cherkashin. Soon I will send a box of documents to Mr. Degtyaryar. They are from certain of the most sensitive and highly compartmented projects of the U.S. intelligence community. In his letters, he gave up the identity of Soviet spies, like Top Hat, a high-ranking and highly productive Soviet officer who was on the CIA payroll.
When you give up the names of live sources, you're doing the maximum damage that you can.
Were they really the top-of-the-line sources?
They were top-of-the-line sources, and they were pulled back, and 2 of the 3 sources were executed after he gave them up.
So you think that was deliberate? That,
yes,
he knew
absolutely.
exactly who he was targeting?
Absolutely. He was getting rid of his competition.
The treachery of it.
The treachery.
But Martin tips his hat to Hanssen for his shrewdness in covering his tracks. He was as much a mystery to the KGB as he was to the FBI, never allowing his Russian handlers to meet him. He communicated with them only in writing.
They didn't know he was with the FBI, and they probably assumed that he was with the CIA.
That's because he threw them off his track by often signing his message with the pen name Ramon Garcia, which ends quite deliberately with the letters CIA. And the information he gave up concerned the CIA, as well as other intelligence agencies, but never the FBI, where he worked. So what kind of man would betray his country so secretly and his wife so publicly?
John Le Carré could not write a novel about Hanssen. Graham Greene couldn't. Even Norman Mailer couldn't. It takes Dostoevsky.
No,
he's the most complex, probably the most complex real character that I've ever had to contend with.
He says the contradictions involving his wife alone were extraordinary.
By the way, he adored her. He worshipped her. He loved her. You can't imagine how much he loved her. But he's a man of parts. So not only did he love her and adore her, he also had to betray her. You see, what you find there is that next to his most noble and loving emotions are his most evil emotions, and they alternate. They alternate. How does he keep from going insane?
Good question, since he was also betraying the church he was seemingly devoted to. Hanssen was and still is a member of a conservative order within the Roman Catholic Church called Opus Dei, Latin for Work of God, a group dedicated to fighting communism. He attended Mass and took communion daily. So he'd go to church, this very conservative Opus Dei order, and pray and deal with the communists.
Pray on his knees.
Right. And
tremble while he prayed.
So while he was praying, are you saying that he was laughing at it?
No, I think he almost demands that you come up with a new kind of psychology to explain him. He's an absolutely devout man, prayed with intensity, brought up his children. He was a model father.
And he would help them write essays about how good America was. And here was a man that was always talking about fighting communism, which was, one of the things that Opus Dei was very much involved in. He is, at the same time, giving the Soviet Union those secrets which are the most important.
This is the epitome of the amoral human being.
You have to find a new word. It's sort of dramatically amoral. Right.
Dr. Alan Solarian, a psychiatrist hired by Hanssen's legal defense team, who spent 30 hours interviewing him, says Hanssen isn't amoral. He's ill, suffering from a severe psychological disorder.
He is driven by demons. He's driven by thoughts, unwanted thoughts.
Solarian says Hanssen shared his whole secret life with his Opus Dei priest.
And he tells the priest, not only his psychological demons, on top of this, he tells this priest that he's also spying. And look the kind of advice he got. Lousy advice. He was told to pray more and to turn the money to Mother Teresa. To me, that's outrageous.
They basically said if you give the money to Mother Teresa, everything will be okay.
Yes, exactly.
Hanssen has told the government that indeed he gave his spy money in the early 80s, about $12,000 up to that time, to Mother Teresa, and then went on to spy some more.
With Bob Hanssen, the church dropped the ball. They fumbled it.
The church's position is that a priest cannot reveal what he learns in confidence. But Solarian thinks the church should have encouraged Hanssen to seek psychiatric help and turn himself in. Instead of using his $600,000 in spy money to bail his family out of debt, Hanssen has 3 mortgages on the house. He spent much of the money on Priscilla Gailey, whom he met at a strip club where she performed.
He goes out with this stripper who was beautiful and had won awards for being the best stripper of the year in this city and that city, including Washington, D.C., and who was a charming, intelligent woman. And he spent a year with her, spent something like $80,000 on her in that year, which was almost equal to his yearly salary, and never made a pass at her.
Right.
Never.
She made a pass at him, but he never made a pass at her. He wanted to convert her.
He rejected her?
Yes.
There's no question he rejected her, but, he still tried to convert her to Catholicism. And this was not the only girl that he did it with. There were several other strippers. One, I think he even succeeded in converting.
He, the exhibitionist, is trying to save an exhibitionist.
You're right on that. But there's another angle. Bob Hanssen was not trying to save Priscilla. Bob Hanssen was trying to save himself. It was, maybe it's too much psychobabble, but in psychiatry we call it projective identification. He put himself onto somebody else and tried to help.
Something else Dr. Solarian believes Hanssen did was use his spying as a way to fend off his demons.
His espionage was an escape from his sexual demons, that when he found himself in an exciting, dangerous position, such as espionage and spying, he found that his demons slow down, they calm down.
You're not going to be able to dismiss Hanssen by speaking of his psychiatric categories. He goes beyond that. He is crazier than crazy. He comes out at the other end because his behavior is so rational, you see, under immense stress and tension. Think of taking these secrets out of the FBI week after week, month after month, year after year. He gave the Russians, the average big spy like Walker or one of those would give 2 or 3 drops a year. In 1 year, Hanssen gave something like 13 or 14 drops.
And here's
it was unheard of. The Russians were just going on, who is this man? He is a genius.
You said that he liked the game. He liked living on the edge.
He found adventure in it, and he looked upon himself as someone who was smarter than everybody else, and he looked down upon his colleagues.
But eventually, the game caught up with him when a Russian spy turned over the entire KGB file on the man known as Ramon Garcia. While the file did not contain Hanssen's name, it did include a tape recording of his voice and his fingerprints lifted from this plastic garbage bag that he once used to wrap classified documents. The perfect spy was not so perfect after all. he got a little sloppy. And so on February 18, 2001, about a month before he was set to retire from the FBI, Hanssen's worlds, all 3 or 4 of them, came crashing down. Is this a tragic figure? Is this somebody we need to reserve just an ounce of pity for? Or is this just outright pure evil, pure criminality?
How about having the difference? A little pity, and he probably is pretty damn evil.
Hanssen, who will be sentenced in May, has agreed to plead guilty to espionage and cooperate with the government. In return, he avoids the death penalty and assures that his wife, Bonnie, will collect most of his pension from his 25 years with the FBI. And finally, what about Bonnie? We're told that she still loves him and completely forgives him.
In April, a career American ambassador pleaded guilty to spying for the intelligence service of Cuba. Victor Manuel Rocha served his country in positions that required the highest levels of security clearance. For 40 years, he was a covert agent. Before Ambassador Rocha was exposed, there was another prolific Cuban spy named Ana Montes, a Pentagon official who was the lead analyst on Cuba policy. She spied for 17 years. But Cuban Spycraft isn't just a relic of the Cold War. It's a real and present danger to U.S. national security. As we first reported this spring, it turns out Cuba's main export isn't cigars or rum, it's American secrets, which they barter and sell to America's enemies around the world. It was 1999, and then First Lady Hillary Clinton danced with the president of Argentina at a state dinner. President Clinton also danced the tango across the White House ballroom. There in front, wearing glasses and the airs of an aristocrat, stood Victor Manuel Rocha. He was the #2 diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, with an impeccable reputation as a senior statesman on Latin America. He served on the National Security Council and became the ambassador to Bolivia, seen here alongside that country's president. All that time while having the highest top-secret security clearance with access to the most sensitive U.S. intelligence. But last December, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced Rocha's arrest. He was charged with spying for Cuba for his entire career.
This action exposes one of the highest-reaching and longest-lasting infiltrations of the U.S. government by a foreign agent.
In 2022, a man claiming to be a Cuban intelligence officer contacted Rocha and asked to meet. Rocha agreed. He had no idea the man was an undercover FBI agent. Over 3 meetings in Miami, the FBI recorded Rocha with a hidden camera. And according to the complaint, Rocha bragged that he got away with decades of spying by memorizing the secrets he stole. Rocha told the agent, "What we have done, it's enormous, more than a grand slam." He called the U.S., quote, "the enemy." What do you think is the extent of damage that he did to national security?
Manuel Rocha did enormous damage to American security.
Brian Littell was the CIA's top Cuba analyst at the height of the Cold War. He says in the 1980s, Rocha cold-called and struck up a professional relationship. They remained friends for decades. You think he approached you to get information out of you, ultimately?
Yes. He never got any.
Did you see any signs that he was leading a double life?
None.
None?
None.
What can you tell me about the tradecraft that Cuba uses?
They do it very, very well in mostly rudimentary fashions. The Cubans are not flying satellites anywhere in the world. Nearly all of their ability and success has been in the dimension of human intelligence. Their officers, their intelligence agents and officers are very, very good. They know their tradecraft. They practice it with great skill and with discipline. And when they recruit, they're very careful about how they recruit and how they communicate.
And what does Cuba do with the information it gets from all of these spies?
They have no scruples about sharing the information or perhaps marketing it, selling it to other countries. The Russians, maybe the Chinese, If they collect information about U.S. intentions, policy intentions toward Moscow or Beijing or Tehran, it would be of interest to those countries.
That was this man's job when he was a Cuban intelligence officer, decoding messages intercepted from the U.S. Jose Cohen defected in 1994.
Es que Cuba compartió esa información con los enemigos de Estados Unidos.
Cuba shared that information with enemies of the United States, he told us. Countries like the Soviet Union for years. Countries like North Korea, countries like Iran had information about the operation of the Defense Department.
You say Cuba may not have the weapons, Cuba may not have the arms, but they sell these secrets to the enemies of the United States.
Más fuerte.
The strongest enemies of the United States. All of that was what made me realize this is a battle between good and evil. Cuba was at the service of all the enemies of the United States. After Jose Cohen set foot on U.S. soil, he shared a vital piece of information with the FBI. That led to the investigation of more than 100 suspected Cuban agents and illegal officers, and ultimately one very important spy. Cohen handed over an encryption key like this one, used by Cuban spies to send and receive secret messages with Havana. 3 nights a week at 9 p.m. and then again at 10, a series of numbered codes was broadcast out of Havana. The signal could be heard for most of the 1990s up the East Coast as far north as Maine. But the coded messages were only meant to be decoded by their agents, including a Pentagon analyst named Ana Montes, who lived in this quiet Washington neighborhood.
This is where she did all of the business, all the spy business.
Exactly. I mean, she would listen to the high-frequency messages upstairs Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday night. She would type up her messages on her computer in her bedroom right up here. This is the area that she lived in, camouflaged the fact that she was committing espionage right here. He says,
Peter Lapp is a retired FBI special agent who was on the team that led the Montes investigation.
How'd she do it?
She went to work, memorized 3 things every day, went home and all classified, and then would write them up or type them up. And then every 2 or 3 weeks, she would meet in person at lunch, broad daylight, 2 to 3 hours over lunch.
Maybe I've seen too many movies. When I think spies, I'm thinking Dark of Night, Park Bench, secret cameras, fancy gadgets.
Right.
That wasn't her.
Everyone who works for the intelligence community goes home with classified information in their head. And you can't stop that with guards and technology. It's just, it's undefeatable.
Lapp wrote a book on the FBI investigation into Montes. He told us Havana doesn't pay its spies, so Americans who spy for Cuba don't do it for money, but rather are driven by ideology. Ambassador Rocha was recruited in the late 1970s, influenced, he now says, by the radical politics of the day. Montes was a student at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in the 1980s and was outspoken about her anger toward U.S. policy in Latin America when she was recruited by a Cuban intelligence officer. Montez's father was a U.S. Army doctor, and her siblings worked for the FBI. One of her first jobs out of graduate school was as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency.
So Ana Montes was already a full-fledged Cuban spy from the moment that she set foot inside the Defense Intelligence Agency.
She walked in fully recruited, day one. Only went to DIA for the purpose of spying for the Cubans. And when you think about the other folks that have been arrested for espionage, most start loyal. They take the oath. They intend to abide by that oath, but then something happens and they flip. And Ana's unique in the sense that she walked in from day one and was an insider threat and only went for the purpose of spying for the Cubans.
How does a Cuban spy walk through the doors of the DIA and get a job? She didn't have to take a polygraph?
They did not have a polygraph program at the time.
Over the course of her career, she became such an expert that she was known in the intelligence community as the Queen of Cuba. All the while, she was exposing national secrets to Havana. The FBI surveilled her for a year before her arrest as she walked to work and called her Cuban handler. By that time, she had revealed the existence of a top-secret satellite program used by the U.S. to spy on other countries. She also gave Havana the names of 450 American intelligence officials working on Latin American issues, including 4 undercover officers stationed in Cuba. And she got away with it for 17 years, until she was arrested in 2001 at her office by FBI Special Agent Peter Lapp and his partner Stephen McCoy.
She didn't fit the profile of a typical spy.
No, being a woman is incredibly unique, so it doesn't fit that typical what we would look for in a spy, which is mostly men.
Montez pleaded guilty to espionage, and in exchange for not spending the rest of her life in prison, she agreed to tell the FBI everything she had done.
I wouldn't mind at all meeting 2 Fridays a month.
Through a public records request, we obtained this footage, seen here for the first time, of Montez wearing prison stripes, speaking with FBI investigators. Citing Montez's right to privacy, the FBI denied our request for the recorded audio of their interviews. But we obtained a declassified transcript of the first day where Montez described how deep in she was. She said, "Ever since I started helping the Cubans, there's been no halfway. I don't really know how a person does it without feeling morally bound. It's a full commitment, mentally, physically, emotionally. I feel that what I did was morally right, that I was faithful to principles that were right." Montez told the agents her only regret was that she was forced to cooperate with the FBI as part of her plea deal. "It's tearing me up," she said, "but if the only way I'm going to see my family again, it's the only way." Agent Lapp sat across from Ana Montez in the interrogation room for 7 months. He said one of the most sobering moments was when she said how far she would have been willing to go for the Cubans in the week after 9/11.
She said, if the Cubans asked me to provide them with intelligence about what we were doing in Afghanistan, I absolutely would have done that. And if men and women were killed as a result of my intelligence in Afghanistan, she told us that's the risk that they took.
What was the extent of the damage that she did?
I do think she's in that tier of some of the most notorious spies in American history, and I think the damage that she did was incredibly significant.
After serving 20 years in federal prison, Ana Montez was released in January 2023. She's now living in Puerto Rico, where she has family and has been celebrated by some as a hero, seen here recently receiving an award from supporters. Through a lawyer, Montez declined our request for an interview. Former Ambassador Victor Manuel Rocha told a judge he was deeply sorry and pleaded guilty to acting as an agent of the Cuban government. At age 73, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and is currently cooperating with investigators. Just how many state secrets he gave to Cuba, we may never know. Nearly all the details of his spycraft remain classified. Ana Montez has yet to publicly express any remorse.
Do you think there are other Ana Montezes in the government right now?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's chilling.
There's no doubt that the Cubans and the Russians and others are still penetrating our government with individuals who are loyal to them and not to us.
When many of us hear the term confidential informants, or as law enforcement calls them, CIs, we think of mobsters wearing a wire to ensnare their bosses and get themselves a better deal. But there's another kind of confidential informant out there that doesn't quite fit the Hollywood image, and in reality may be far more common. Young people, many of them college students, caught selling small amounts of marijuana who are recruited by law enforcement to wear a wire and make undercover drug buys in exchange for having their charges reduced or dropped altogether. It's a practice, we discovered, that's going on across the country, largely under the radar, and in some cases with tragic consequences.
How's it going today?
All right.
It's your birthday today.
Yeah.
Finding out what you want to be doing on your birthday, huh?
What you're looking at is police footage of the making of a confidential informant. Narcotics officer Jason Weber is recruiting a college student who'd been caught making 2 small marijuana sales to become a CI.
All right, well, you expressed interest that you probably want to help yourself out.
Yeah. We're always trying to go up the chain. And so what we want to go is have them buy from their supplier or suppliers.
Weber is the chief of a 4-county drug task force in eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota. How important do you think confidential informants are to your task?
Yeah, confidential informants are really important to law enforcement across the country. They make our jobs easier just because they are already the ones that are out there that know who the drug dealers are and rely on them.
Most of the kids that you're recruiting caught for marijuana sales?
The big majority, yeah.
Weber's jurisdiction includes the campus of the North Dakota State College of Science with some 3,000 students. Marijuana is now legal in 4 states and the District of Columbia, but not in North Dakota, where selling even a small amount on a campus is a Class A felony with a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, a fine of $20,000, or both.
2 felonies.
This young man, Andrew Sadek, was caught on tape by another confidential informant making 2 sales for a total of $80. Weber has called Sadek in before charging him to present a choice. Agree to work as a CI, wear a wire, and make undercover drug buys from 3 people twice each, or be charged with 2 Class A felonies.
Potentially, the max is 40 years in prison, $40,000 fine. You understand that?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, you're probably not going to get 40 years, but is it a good possibility that you're going to get some prison time? If you don't help yourself out, yeah, there is. Okay. That's probably not a way to start off your young adult life and your career, right?
Sadek took the deal. Weber told us most students do. Part of the agreement he signed? Keep the whole thing strictly to himself.
You can't tell anybody you're working for me, for obvious reasons.
An award-winning student of electrical technology, Andrew Sadek did as he was told. Never told any of his close friends about being an informant, never called a lawyer, and didn't breathe a word to his parents, Tammy and John Sadek. The Sadeks are a ranching family, still struggling with the death of their older son in a train accident years earlier, leaving Andrew an only child. If Andrew had told you that he was thinking of becoming a confidential informant, what do you think your reaction would have been?
Oh, we'd have gotten him a lawyer and told him no.
We've never heard of such a thing, you know, using college students for snitches or whatever you want to call them, stool pigeons, or I don't know, what do you call them, you know?
There's no parent that I know of who would allow their child or want their child to serve as a confidential informant.
To set up a drug deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's too dangerous. No, I wouldn't want my child to do it.
Lance Block is an attorney in Tallahassee, Florida, who opposes using young people caught for relatively minor offenses as confidential informants.
These kids are being recruited to do the most dangerous type of police work. They're going undercover with no background, training, or experience. They haven't been to the police academy.
So they are basically doing the same work as a trained undercover cop?
Absolutely.
Block says he was unaware police were using young people as confidential informants until he was hired 7 years ago by the family of Rachel Hoffman, a recent college graduate who was caught with a large stash of marijuana and a few Valium and ecstasy pills. It was her second marijuana arrest.
She was caught by the Tallahassee Police Department and told that if she didn't become a confidential informant, she was looking at 4 years in prison.
She signed up, and a few weeks later was sent out to make her first undercover drug buy. It was to be one of the biggest in Tallahassee's recent history. 1,500 ecstasy pills, an ounce and a half of cocaine, and a gun. Had she ever dealt in any of those things?
No.
A gun? Had she ever fired a gun?
No. Rachel was a pothead. And Rachel sold marijuana to her friends out of her home. But Rachel wasn't dealing in ecstasy or cocaine, much less, of course, not weapons.
Rachel drove her car alone to meet the dealers in this park with $13,000 cash from the police and a wire in her purse. She was to be monitored by some 20 officers. But then the dealers changed the location of the deal, so Rachel drove away from the police staging area, and that's when things went terribly wrong.
The drug dealers have her out on this road. One drug dealer gets into the car with her.
And the 20 cops who were nearby?
They lost her.
Hoffman is 5'7", 135 pounds.
Hoffman was seen Wednesday night at about 7 o'clock near Forest Meadows Park.
They shot her 5 times when they found the wire in her purse and dumped her body in a ditch 50 miles away.
Rachel Hoffman's tragic death turned Block into an advocate. He sued the city of Tallahassee and won a $2.8 million settlement for Rachel's parents. And he has argued for more openness and greater protection for confidential informants ever since. Do you have any sense of how many confidential informants there are?
You know, law enforcement is loaded with statistics, but you cannot find out any information about the number of confidential informants that are being used across this country, much less the number of people who are being killed or injured.
No one's keeping statistics.
No one. It's a shadowy underworld is what it is.
We want to make more cases. We want to make better cases that can get prosecuted. Informants can do that.
Brian Sallee is a longtime undercover narcotics officer who believes a shadowy underworld is exactly what working with CI should be. Shadowy to protect informants' identities, and underworld because that's where cops like him want informants to take them.
Who knows the most about the dope trade? Is it us working narcotics? No. Who is it? The sellers, the dopers.
Sallee says he's worked with hundreds of informants and now trains police officers around the country on how best to use them. If you had not been able personally to use confidential informants, would you have been as effective?
Nowhere near as effective.
You really feel you need
Oh,
this?
I know I would not. I may have to watch a house for days or weeks to establish probable cause. My informant goes in and makes a buy out of it, and I have my probable cause in 5 minutes. You can get into cases quicker, easier, some respects safer.
I'm surprised you say safer, because we've heard about kids who've been killed doing these operations.
It's a dangerous trade that they're involved in.
Yeah.
They are in that drug trade. They've always been facing that potential danger. Any informant.
Sallee estimates there could be as many as 100,000 confidential informants working with police across the country. And he says with just a few tragic exceptions, it's a win-win. A win for society and a win for the CI.
They have agreed to do what they are doing in exchange for something. That's the bottom line. When somebody comes to work for me as an informant, it's their decision.
Police tell us that this is completely voluntary, and they want to do this to get rid of the charges.
It's not something that college kids are standing up saying, I want to be a CI. It's not voluntary. They're being told they're looking at prison time unless they agree to do deals for the police department.
And there are some important things they're not being told. So what if you catch me selling $60 worth of marijuana? What do you say to me to become an informant?
I'll say, this is the charge, this is a felony, do you want to help yourself out?
Do you tell me that I have a right to talk to a lawyer?
No, I do not. I tell you have a right to talk to a lawyer if I'm going to ask you incriminating questions. If we're talking about you becoming an informant, I don't have to tell you that you have a right to a lawyer.
All right.
That's because since police often recruit confidential informants before charging them and without arresting them, they're not obligated by law to read them their rights. And Weber didn't with Andrew Sadek.
Okay.
He told us Sadek made 3 successful undercover drug buys as a CI, half the number he'd been told was required of him. But then he stopped. Weber says Sadek was warned he would soon be charged if he didn't continue. Then one night, a few weeks shy of graduation, security cameras snapped these pictures of Sadek walking out of his dorm at 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning. A day and a half later, he had not come back.
We got a call from the campus. At about noon on Friday, he went
Still
missing.
completely unaware of their son's work as a confidential informant, Andrew's parents were soon on campus making a public plea for his return.
We love you, and we want you. We need you to come home.
Everything will be okay.
There was searches, prayer vigils, and then 2 months later, the worst news possible. Andrew's body was discovered in a river near the campus, his backpack weighted down with rocks, its straps tied together across his chest. Did they tell you what the cause of death was?
Gunshot to the head.
A year and a half later, that's about all the Saddocks have been told. No one has been charged in Andrew's death, and the gun that killed him has not been found. Police deny he was involved in any CI operation the night he disappeared and have suggested to his parents that he may have shot himself, a possibility they say is inconceivable. They're convinced their son was murdered as a result of his work as an informant, and they want the confidential recruitment of young offenders as CIs to stop.
It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Stop doing it. Slap their hands, fine them, put them in jail, expel them. I don't care. Stop using our kids to do your jobs.
Andrew Saddock's death is still an open investigation, so neither the state agencies in charge of the case nor Jason Weber would talk about it. But we did ask about putting these kids at risk. Andrew Saddock was caught selling $80 worth of marijuana. People have said to us, it's just not worth it. And it's not worth putting the kid in any kind of risky situation for that little.
You know, a drug dealer is a drug dealer, whether you smell a big amount or a small amount, whether you do it once or if you do it 100 times. While it's still against the law, part of our duties as law enforcement is to get the drugs off the streets and to get the drug dealers off the streets.
So how successful is what you're doing?
Well, I think it goes back to the point, if we don't try something or if we don't do that, then we're truly losing the war on drugs.
Isn't it more important to go after heroin, meth, cocaine?
Yeah, our agency goes after all of them.
I'm still trying to get at the equation. You know what I mean? Is it worth it for marijuana?
Yeah, there again, I got to go back to, as long as it's a crime, it is my duty as a police officer to enforce criminal law.
We've spoken to college students who talk about how they were pressured into becoming confidential informants.
Felt like I had a gun in my head.
That part of the story when we come back. We wanted to know what the law is across the country about the use of young people as confidential informants. And we were surprised to discover that in all but a handful of states, there is no law. No age limits on who can become a CI, no rules about how or even whether informants must be trained, no guidelines on their protection. Policies are typically left up to the individual police departments that recruit and use the informants. And that, critics say, can and has resulted in overly aggressive recruitment tactics, traumatized and even suicidal CIs, and situations where kids are given incentives to entrap other kids. We looked at a case, a narcotics unit, where those charges have been leveled. It's in one of the country's best-known college towns, with the university itself an involved partner and funder. The University of Mississippi in Oxford, famously called Old Miss, is known for its football, its school spirit, and its southern charm. But less than a mile from campus, housed in this municipal building, is a drug task force focused on the darker side of life here. It's called Metro Narcotics, and one of its confidential informants was an Ole Miss student we'll call Greg, who agreed to speak with us in disguise.
I was finishing up with school one day.
His life as a CI began one day coming home from class.
I was met halfway there by men in bulletproof vests, guns, and badges around their necks. My initial reaction was just keep going. This is no way involved with me. And then until they held up a piece of paper with my name on it, saying I sold LSD, and I thought, what on earth? I had nothing to do with this.
Greg, who had no criminal record, insists his only encounter with LSD was when a friend asked to leave some at his apartment. Then he says another acquaintance stopped by, wearing a wire it turns out, and picked the LSD up.
I was just on the couch watching TV, and he was like, oh, thanks, and I just said, I have nothing to do with this, don't thank me.
But at the Metro office, Greg says 2 agents threatened him with more than 20 years in prison and a felony on his record for life unless he agreed to become an informant and make drug buys wearing a wire from 10 people who he had to find himself.
It felt like I had a gun to my head.
Have you told them yet that you had nothing to do with this?
They almost convince you that you're guilty. I was just so scared. I was just putty in their hands.
Did you think about the idea that you'd become a snitch?
I mean, I knew what I was signing and I hated it, absolutely. It just made me sick, but what made me more sick was the thought of spending 20 years in prison.
Did you know 10 people you could buy drugs from when you signed that paper?
Absolutely not. But you don't care at the time. When you sign it, it's like, sure, you know, please don't ruin my life.
10 buys. Sounds like a lot.
It's virtually impossible.
Ken Coughlin is a defense attorney in Oxford who has represented many Ole Miss students who became confidential informants. He says that because there are no standardized rules, cops can ask for any number of buys, like Metro's 10, which he says is so high, it creates a perverse incentive for kids to entice other kids to break the law. He told us he has seen it again and again.
They don't know 10 drug dealers. And they're so desperate, they will go to their friend or their roommate or their frat brother, and they know this person smokes marijuana. And they'll say, I'm out of weed. Can I get $10 worth of weed from you?
Your personal stuff.
That's entrapment. And that's not allowed under the law.
Entrapment because that frat brother with his own marijuana was only guilty of possession, a misdemeanor under Mississippi law. But if he says yes and sells a little to his buddy, he's now become a dealer, a felon facing possible prison time.
And at that point, we're not catching criminals, we're creating criminals.
Did you ever get the feeling that you were asking someone else to commit a crime that they wouldn't otherwise have committed?
Yes. I just knew somebody who would provide me with an amount who wasn't selling, but I just knew that they would because we knew each other.
And you did that?
Yes.
So when you say they're creating felons, this is what you mean.
I don't think the cops say, go out and talk somebody into doing it that wouldn't otherwise do it. It's just what the kids do. And look, there are some hard drugs around, but the vast, vast majority of cases are sale of 2 grams of marijuana. 3 grams of marijuana.
But those small sales can add up to big numbers of arrests. And numbers, says Tallahassee attorney Lance Block, help drug task forces get grants.
They want to drive up their arrest numbers. And it doesn't matter whether they're going after a college kid with a couple of joints in his pocket or whether they're going after a drug kingpin.
And the more arrests, the more money?
The arrest numbers, the higher they go, the better the funding. I mean, law enforcement is addicted to the drug war money as the crack addict is on the street to his drugs.
It's a strong charge. We put it to undercover narcotics agent and instructor Brian Salee. What they say is that police are in this to lift their arrest statistics to justify the grants and money that they're getting.
I'm in it to do what is best for my community. And if having higher stats gets me more money and allows me to do more cases to then impact the drug trade in my community, then that's also of a benefit.
Metro Narcotics got nearly $55,000 in federal grants last year. But most of their budget comes from the city police, the county sheriff's department, and Ole Miss, $100,000 each. The head of Metro Narcotics for the last 5 years has been Keith Davis, seen here on an Ole Miss student newscast defending his unit's work with students as informants.
These are adults. These are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Yes, I get it. They have young minds, whatever. But they're out here creating felonies and hurting our communities.
We requested our own interview with Davis or any representative of Metro Narcotics, but they declined. One thing we wanted to ask Davis about were charges that he and other agents in the unit were abusive to the CIs.
They call you, and in these calls, they're very aggressive and threatening and saying, well, we're going to come pick you up and you're going to go to prison. To the point where I was just terrified whenever my phone rang.
We heard similar claims from another Ole Miss student who became a confidential informant after Metro Narcotics accused him of selling marijuana.
They say your life is over if you, as you know it, if you tell anybody, if you don't help us.
Did they specifically say you can't call your parents?
They said if you call your parents, we'll take you to jail.
Once he agreed, he says one of the first things the agent asked him was whether he could buy meth or heroin. He told him he couldn't.
The first 8 months or so, he called every single day at around the same time.
He called you every day for 8 months?
Every day.
We had heard repeated accusations about the aggressive tone of the Metro agents, and then got to listen for ourselves when we obtained a tape recording of Keith Davis and another Metro agent yelling at a CI recruit they heard had made a threat to find out where they lived. The first voice is that of Agent Tommy Knight.
I don't give a where you at. Yes, sir. I'll turn this in and I'll come beat the out you. Yes, sir. Get that in your head.
Whoa. The tape was made surreptitiously by the CI recruit who brought it to Ken Coughlin. We listened with him as Keith Davis made his own threat if the kid ever went to his house.
Come here, it'll be the last place you ever go in your life.
Yes, sir.
You feel me?
100%.
It took all I had and I come see you last night.
Yes, sir.
To hunt you down. But I'm trying to calm him down.
Keith Davis is the chief of this narcotics unit, and he is making a death threat.
You know, I'm just going to let the tape speak for itself.
Coughlin sent the tape and a letter to the chancellor and attorney of Ole Miss more than 2 years ago, thinking that as a funder of Metro Narcotics, they should know how the unit was treating its students. He got no reply, and we could find no evidence that changes were made to the program at that time.
You know, go to the store.
Greg told us that as he continued making undercover buys, he became anxious and paranoid.
And I would have to conceal that I was shaking because, first of all, I completely detested what I was doing. I didn't want to get anybody in trouble.
Did you feel ashamed?
Absolutely.
Because of turning in other kids?
Yes.
But Keith Davis told the Ole Miss campus reporter that these kids don't deserve that much sympathy.
Let's be clear here. These people are not these innocent little college kids, plain and simple. The ones that are selling dope are not innocent people. They're selling poison.
That may be true for many confidential informants, but it turns out not Greg. After a year and a half, and he says making 6 of the 10 required buys, Greg was charged and arrested anyway. That's when his parents found out and hired Coughlin, who researched the original evidence against Greg and came to the conclusion that the friend who brought the LSD to Greg's house in the first place had been a CI. So a CI brought the drugs and a CI bought the drugs.
That's the way I understood it to be.
Coughlin says after he brought the situation to the attention of the district attorney, the charges against Greg were dismissed. All the charges were just thrown out.
Completely.
And it's really important that the public have an understanding of what's going on because it's perverted justice.
I've been told that a lot of these kids are not really looking at jail time.
In the vast majority of cases, these kids would be diverted into a drug court program. They'd be on probation for 6 months to a year. And at the end, if they've done everything successfully, then the cases are dismissed.
Lance Block has been advocating for laws to regulate the recruitment and use of confidential informants across the country. But he says law enforcement lobbies have opposed the reforms.
They want to keep the CI system as it is.
Law enforcement people have told us, we see it as a win-win. The kids get a reduced or charges completely expunged, and we get to arrest drug dealers.
But they're kids that are being killed, and they're arresting small-time possessors. That's a lose-lose. We asked Ole Miss for an on-camera interview while we were reporting our story. Our request was declined.
We did get a letter months later saying, quote, "Thank you for your part in encouraging a deeper look at the Metro Narcotics Unit and telling us that because of increased attention from 60 Minutes and the news organization BuzzFeed, changes were being made, including more direct oversight of the program, an audit of the program by a third-party organization, policies to ensure suspects fully understand they have a choice in whether to become a confidential informant, and a change in leadership." At the end of September, Keith Davis resigned as head of the unit. He now works for the Sheriff's Department.
We're used to spy novels about the Russians, but today's reality in espionage is different. China has just as good a spy network in the United States, and tonight you are going to see a Chinese spy caught red-handed taking American military secrets from an employee of the Defense Department. If China is the Asian dragon, then it has awakened to compete with the United States all around the world for resources, markets, and strategic advantage. The Chinese are also shopping for information, ranging from U.S. nuclear weapons designs to the inside deliberations of the Obama White House. Because of the nature of espionage, you never get a look at this clandestine underworld. But recently, the FBI recorded a Chinese agent stealing America's secrets, and we're making the video public for the first time.
There's a nice Thai restaurant out there. Okay.
This is what espionage looks like. The man driving the car is Greg Bergerson. He's a civilian analyst at the Pentagon with one of the nation's highest security clearances. His companion is Tai-Shin Guo, a spy for the People's Republic of China. This is Guo in an FBI surveillance photo. He was born in Taiwan, but he's a naturalized American citizen who owns a number of businesses in Louisiana. And this is Bergerson, who worked at the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which manages weapons sales to U.S. allies. Bergerson knew a secret that the Chinese desperately wanted to know. What kind of weapons was America planning to sell to Taiwan, the rebellious Chinese island that mainland China wants to reclaim? It's July 2007. They're driving outside Washington, and neither man knows that what they're about to do is being recorded by two cameras the FBI has concealed in their car.
I like this. I just let you hit the money. Whoa. You sure that that's okay? Yeah. You sure?
We watched the tape with John Slattery, the FBI agent at headquarters who oversaw the case. He recently retired as a deputy assistant director.
What's happening there? Information has been passed prior, and this is reward for that, or there is expectation that passage of information is forthcoming. So that's what's happening right here. How much money is he holding in his hand? I think we're probably looking at about $2,000, thereabouts.
Tai-Shin Guo's money and contacts came to the FBI's attention while the Bureau was investigating a different Chinese espionage case. They followed him, tapped his phone, watched his email, and all of that led to Bergerson. In the car, the Pentagon employee and Chinese spy were plotting the handover of secret documents that listed future weapons sales to Taiwan and details of a Taiwanese military communication system.
I'm very, 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 very reticent to let you have it because it's all classified. But I will let you see it, and you can take all the notes you want, which I think you can do today. But if it ever fell into the wrong hands, I know it's not going to, but if it ever was, then I would be fired for sure. I'd go to jail because I violated all the rules.
He just described them as classified documents. Exactly.
He knows precisely what he's doing.
Exactly.
He's almost going down your list of requirements for an indictment by a grand jury.
And we thank him for that.
When it comes to espionage against the United States, is China now the #1 threat that we face?
I would be hard-pressed to say whether it's the Chinese or it's the Russians, but they're 1-2 or 2-1.
Michelle Van Cleve was America's top counterintelligence officer. Working for the Director of National Intelligence, she was in charge of coordinating the hunt for foreign spies from 2003 to 2006.
The Chinese are the biggest problem we have with respect to the level of effort that they're devoting against us versus the level of attention we are giving to them.
What do the Chinese want from us?
Virtually every technology that is on the U.S. controlled technology list has been targeted. Sensors and optics and biological and chemical processes. These are the things, information technologies, across all of the things that we have identified as having inherent military application.
The Chinese have stolen technology used in the space shuttle and in submarine propulsion systems. In the late 1990s, a congressional commission found that China now holds the most closely guarded secrets America had.
We learned, and the Cox Commission reported, that the Chinese had acquired the design information for all U.S. thermonuclear weapons currently in our inventory.
Make sure I understand. The Chinese are in possession today of the designs of all of our nuclear weapons?
Yes.
How did they get that?
The questions of how they acquired it remain, to some extent, unknown.
How the U.S. lost its atomic secrets may be unknown, but there are fewer mysteries in the case of Tai-Shin Kuo and Greg Bergerson. The FBI says that Kuo wanted to expand his Louisiana businesses into China, and when he sought permission from Beijing, the Chinese asked for a few favors for their intelligence service. The $2,000 was only part of Kuo's development of Bergerson. Kuo wined and dined his spy, and Bergerson seemed to have an appetite for espionage. At one dinner, Kuo's tab came to $710. Kuo took Bergerson to Las Vegas for some shows, and the day of the ride, Kuo brought a box of expensive cigars. All the while, Kuo lied to Bergerson, telling him that the information was being passed to Taiwan, the U.S. ally. Does that make any difference in the law, whether you're spying for a hostile government or a friendly one?
Of course not. Classified information is not allowed to be passed without, certain approvals to any foreign government.
But I think when you see the information, you can get out of it what you need. You can you can take all the notes you want. It's just, I cannot ever let anyone know, because that'll that's my job, man. I get fired for sure on that. Well, not even get fired, I'll go to jail.
The recruitment of Bergerson has a familiar ring to Fengji Li. Li recruited spies for China as an officer in the Ministry of State Security. The MSS is their CIA. Give me a sense of all the different ways you would persuade someone to spy for China.
That should be a long story.
I've got time.
Okay.
In our interview, Li switched between English and Mandarin. He worked for Chinese intelligence 14 years, recruiting spies in Russia. He's now seeking political asylum in the U.S.
Let me say this. Intelligence work is different from other kind of work. When I target 100 people, even if 99 people have refused me, if there is one I persuade...
That's enough.
That's enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Li told us that he recruited spies through blackmail and sometimes greed, especially if someone wanted to do business in China. Once, he says, his agents recruited the official photographer for a European head of state that he still won't name. Would you say the MSS spends most of its effort on the United States?
Definitely, without a doubt.
What would some examples be of the kind of information that MSS was interested in getting a hold of?
For example, what the President Obama thinks right now.
They want to know what President Obama thinks.
Yes.
If you make me part of the owner,
Thanks to Greg Bergerson, the Chinese were about to find out just what sort of weapons America intended to sell to Taiwan. The day of that car ride, Bergerson drove Guo and the secret documents to a restaurant outside Washington, D.C. Inside the restaurant, Guo copied the secrets by hand. Out in the parking lot, Bergerson waited with a glass of wine, one of those cigars, and the FBI in tow. As they left, Bergerson just couldn't stop talking.
But I will be very careful to keep my tracks, of course, clean and no fingerprints. Just like these documents, no fingerprints. I can't afford to lose my job.
Later, Guo left the U.S. for Beijing, but while he waited for his flight, federal agents got into his bags, photocopied his handwritten notes, and put them back. Guo's notes matched the secret document on the right. But John Slattery, who oversaw the case for the FBI, told us the Bureau didn't make arrests until 6 months later. But I mean, this is drop-dead evidence. And espionage is occurring. Why didn't you arrest them sooner than that?
Well, these investigations are tremendously complex and tremendously difficult to begin with.
The Department of Defense wants you to stop it right away.
Please, sooner than later. But the FBI says, listen, we want to make sure we can sustain a conviction here, and are there other players in this?
Turns out there were other players. Guo had another source inside the Pentagon, and Guo was connected to spies on the West Coast who were giving up U.S. space and naval technology. Presumably, the U.S. is doing the same kind of spying in China, but Michelle Van Cleve says America has so much more to lose.
I think we're a real candy store for the Chinese and for others in terms of technology and commercial products, rather proprietary information, and so we will always be the principal target for them.
What is the most serious damage that Chinese espionage has done to the United States?
It's the totality of the collection effort. Take a case like this, or cases like this, traditional espionage, penetration of the interior, couple that with industrial and economic collection, couple that with cyber. It greatly concerns me. It greatly concerns me.
Well, I hope this all works out. I mean, you are helping me a lot here, but I don't want anyone to know about our relationship or anything, because she get me in a lot of trouble.
Bergerson kept saying, I could go to jail, and both men did. In 2008, prosecutors showed them this tape, and they pled guilty. Bergerson got almost 5 years for communicating national defense information. Guo, a naturalized American citizen, is in a U.S. prison doing 15 years for espionage. Prison may have been the best option Bergerson had, because after he left the car, Guo pulled out his own tape recorder. We'll never know why he taped the damning conversation, but it is classic spycraft to use blackmail to get at ever deeper and deeper secrets. For every case that is broken, like the Bergerson case, for example, how many others are there that we have no idea about?
Oh, isn't that the important question? You never know what you don't know. But certainly we have seen such an extensive range of activities by the Chinese that it should make you very uncomfortable.
For as casually as we often toss around the word hero, sometimes no lesser term applies. Tonight, we'll introduce you to members of a secret American intelligence unit who fought in World War II. What's most extraordinary about this group? Many of them were German-born Jews who fled their homeland, came to America, and then joined the U.S. Army. Their mission? To use their knowledge of the German language and culture to return to Europe and fight Nazism. The Ritchie Boys, as they were known, trained in espionage and frontline interrogation. And incredibly, they were responsible for most of the combat intelligence gathered on the Western Front. For decades, they didn't discuss their work. Fortunately, some of the Ritchie Boys are still around to tell their tales, and that includes the life force that is Guy Stern, age 99. You work 6 days a week, you swim every morning, you lecture, any signs of slowing down?
Well, I think not. But I don't run as fast. I don't swim as fast. But I feel happy with my tasks.
Just 2 weeks shy of turning 100, Guy Stern drips with vitality. He still works 6 days a week. And if you get up early enough, you might catch him working out at his local park in the suburbs of Detroit. But ask him about his most formative experience, and he doesn't hesitate. It was his service in the military during World War II. What was it like for you leaving Nazi Germany, escaping as a Jew, and the next time you go back to Europe, it's to fight those guys? What was that like?
I was a soldier doing my job. And that precluded any concern that I was going back to a country I once was very attached to. I had a war to fight, and I did it.
This is Guy Stern 80 years ago. He's among the last surviving Ritchie Boys, a group of young men, many of them German Jews, who played an outsized role in helping the Allies win World War II. They took their name from the place they trained, Camp Ritchie, Maryland, a secret American military intelligence center during the war. Starting in 1942, more than 11,000 soldiers went through the rigorous training at what was the Army's first centralized school for intelligence and psychological warfare.
The purpose of the facility was to train interrogators. That was the biggest weakness that the Army recognized it had, which was battlefield intelligence and the interrogation needed to talk to sometimes civilians, most of the time prisoners of war, in order to glean information from them.
David Fry is a professor of history and director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. How effective were they at gathering intelligence?
They were incredibly effective. 60+% of the actionable intelligence gathered on the battlefield was gathered by Ritchie Boys.
60% of the actionable intelligence?
Yes. They made a massive contribution to essentially every battle that the Americans fought, the entire sets of battles on the Western Front.
Recruits were chosen based on their knowledge of European language and culture, as well as their high IQs. Essentially, they were intellectuals. The largest set of graduates were 2,000 German-born Jews.
If we take Camp Ritchie in microcosm, it was almost the ideal of an American melting pot. You had people coming from all over, uniting for a particular cause.
All in service of winning the war.
All in service of winning the war, and there's nothing that forges unity better than having a common enemy. You had a whole load of immigrants who really wanted to get back into the fight.
Immigrants like Guy Stern. He grew up in a close-knit family in the town of Hildesheim, Germany. When Hitler took power in 1933, Stern says the climate grew increasingly hostile.
My fellow students, it was an all-male school, withdrew from you.
Because you were Jewish, you were ostracized.
That is correct. I went to my father one day and I said, classes are becoming a torture chamber.
By 1937, violence against Jews was escalating. Sensing danger, Stern's father tried to get the family out. But the Sterns could only send one of their own to the U.S. They chose their eldest son. Do you remember saying goodbye to your family?
Yes.
What do you remember from that?
Handkerchiefs. I couldn't know at that point that I would never see my siblings or my parents again, nor my grandmother, and so forth and so on.
Guy Stern arrived in the U.S. alone at age 15, settling with an uncle in St. Louis. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, Stern, by then a college student, raced to enlist.
I had an immediate visceral response to that, and that was, this is my war for many reasons, personal of course, but also this country, I was really treated well.
In New York, Paul Fairbrook had a similar impulse. Now 98, Fairbrook is the former dean of the Culinary Institute of America. His Jewish family left Germany in 1933, when he was 10. Why did you want to enlist initially?
Look, I'm a German Jew, and there's nothing that I wanted more is to get some revenge on Hitler, who killed my uncles and my aunts and my cousins. And there was no question in my mind, and neither of all the men in Camp Ritchie, so many of them were Jewish, we were all on the same wavelength. We were delighted to get a chance to do something for the United States.
At the time, though, the military wouldn't take volunteers who weren't born in the U.S. But within a few months, the government realized these so-called enemy aliens could be a valuable resource in the war. Why were the Ritchie Boys so successful?
Well, because it was an unusual part of the United States Army. You can learn to shoot a rifle in 6 months, but you can't learn fluent German in 6 months, and that's what the key to the success was.
Was it your knowledge of the language or your knowledge of the psychology and the German culture?
Oh, that's a very good question. That is the key to being a good interrogator. You really know an awful lot of the subtleties when you're having a conversation with another German. And we were able to find out things in their answers that enabled us to ask more questions. You really have to understand, it helps to have been born in Germany in order to do a good job.
Both refugees like Fairbrook and Stern, as well as a number of American-born recruits with requisite language skills, were drafted into the Army and sent to Camp Ritchie. How did you find out you were going to go to Camp Ritchie?
I was called to the company office and told, you're shipping out. And I said, may I know where I'm going? He said, no, military secret.
They swore you to secrecy.
Yes.
Originally a resort, Camp Ritchie was a curiously idyllic setting to prepare for the harshness and brutality of war. Nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Maryland, it was away from prying eyes and prying spies, but close enough to decision makers at the Pentagon. Give us a sense of the kinds of courses they took.
Well, the most important part of the training was that they learned to do interrogation, in particular of prisoners of war. Techniques where you want to get people to talk to you. You want to convince them that you're trustworthy. You want to give them that feeling that you know who they are, they know who you are, you know a lot about them already, so whatever information they're giving you is information that you probably already know. But they also did terrain analysis. They also did photo analysis and aerial reconnaissance analysis. They did counterintelligence training.
This is really a broad range of intelligence activities.
It was a very broad range, and they did it all generally in 8 weeks.
What you describe, it almost sounds like these were precursors to CIA agents.
They were, in fact. Some of them were trained as spies, and some of them went on to careers as spies.
My parents were pacifists, so the idea of my going to war was for them calamitous. However, they realized that it was a necessary war, especially for us.
Victor Brombert, now 98 years old, is a former professor of Romance languages and literature at Yale and then Princeton. He was born in Berlin to a Russian Jewish family. When Hitler came to power, the Bromberts fled to France and then to the U.S. Eager to fight the Nazis, he too joined the army. After recruiters found out he spoke 4 languages, they dispatched him to Camp Ritchie, where strenuous classroom instruction was coupled with strenuous field exercises.
They were long and demanding exercises and close combat training, how to kill a sentry from behind. I thought, I'm never going to do that, but I was shown how to do it.
So physical combat training
well,
as well
as
as
with a stick, you sort of swing it around the neck from behind and then pull.
Among the unusual sights at Ritchie, a team of U.S. soldiers dressed in German uniforms. The Ritchie Boys trained for war against these fake Germans with fake German tanks made out of wood. Another unusual sight, towering over recruits, Frank Levitt, a World War I veteran and pro wrestling star at the time, was among the instructors. Training was designed to be as realistic as possible. The Ritchie Boys practiced street fighting in life-size replicas of German villages and questioned mock civilians in full-scale German homes. Some of the prisoners were actual German POWs brought to Camp Ritchie, so the Ritchie Boys could practice their interrogation techniques. I understand you had sparring partners. You play-acted.
One had to play act with. Some of the people were acting as prisoners, and some of them were real prisoners.
By the spring of 1944, the Ritchie Boys were ready to return to Western Europe, this time as naturalized Americans in American uniforms. Still, if they were captured, they knew what the Nazis would do to them. Some of them requested new dog tags, with very good reason. This dog tag says Hebrew. Did your dog tag identify you as Jewish?
I preferred not having it. I asked them to leave it off.
You didn't want to be identified as Jewish going back to Western Europe?
No, because I knew that the contact with Germans might not be very nice.
On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched one of the most sweeping military operations in history. A mighty onslaught of more than 160,000 men, 13,000 aircraft, and 5,000 vessels.
We were on a PT boat taking off from Southampton, and we all were scared. We were briefed that the Germans were not going to welcome us greatly. As a Jew, I knew I might not be treated exactly by the Geneva rules.
Divided into six-man teams, the Ritchie Boys were attached to different army units. Their job? To provide battlefield intelligence. When they landed on the beaches of Normandy, Wehrmacht troops were waiting for them, well-armed and well-prepared. Victor Brombert was with the 1st American Armored Division to land on Omaha Beach. He is still haunted by what he experienced that day.
I saw immense debris, wounded people, dead people. I remember being up on the cliff the first night over Omaha Beach, and we were strafed, and I said to myself, now it's the end, because I could feel the machine gun bullets.
Is that when you first realized, I'm in a war here?
Yes, I realized that I was afraid. I never calculated that there is such a thing as terror, fear. So I experienced viscerally fear.
On the front lines from Normandy onwards, the Ritchie Boys fought in every major battle in Europe, collecting tactical intelligence, interrogating prisoners and civilians, all in service of winning the war. When we come back, we'll hear about some of the surprising ways they forged connections with the enemy in order to extract strategic information. In 1944, the Ritchie Boys headed to Europe to fight in a war that was for them intensely personal. They were members of a secret group whose mastery of the German language and culture helped them provide battlefield intelligence that proved pivotal to the Allies' victory. The Ritchie Boys landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day and helped liberate Paris. They crossed into Germany with the Allied armies and witnessed the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. All the while, they tracked down evidence and interrogated Nazi criminals later tried at Nuremberg. It was also in Europe that some of them, like Guy Stern, learned what had happened to the families they left behind.
This is it. They're on the beach.
By the summer of 1944, German troops in Normandy were outnumbered and overpowered. The Allies liberated Paris in August.
The date was August 25th.
And drove Nazi troops out of France. But Hitler was determined to continue the war. In the Ardennes region of Belgium, the Germans mounted a massive counteroffensive, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge. I see a tent in the background of that photo right in front of you.
Yes, that's my interrogation tent.
So this is you on the job. You're
yes,
in Belgium?
Doing my job interrogating, right.
Amid the chaos of war, Guy Stern and the other Ritchie Boys had a job to do. Embedded in every army unit, they interrogated tens of thousands of captured Nazi soldiers, as well as civilians, extracting key strategic information on enemy strength, troop movements, and defensive positions. They then typed up their daily reports in the field to be passed up the chain of command.
Our interrogations It had to do with tactical, immediate concerns. And that's why civilians could be useful and soldiers could be useful. Where is the minefield? Very important, because you save life if you know where is the machine gun nest? How many machine guns do you have there? Where are your reserve units? And if you don't get it from one prisoner, you might get it from the other.
98-year-old Victor Bromberg says they relied on their Camp Ritchie training to get people to open up.
We improvised according to the situation, according to the kind of unit, according to the kind of person we were interrogating. But certainly what did not work was violence or threat of violence. Never. What did work is complicity.
What do you mean?
By complicity, I mean, we are together in this war, you on one side, we on this side. Isn't it a miserable thing? Aren't we all sort of tired of it?
This shared experience.
Shared experience, exactly. Giving out some cigarettes also helps a lot. A friendly approach, trying to be human.
The Ritchie Boys connected with prisoners on subjects as varied as food and soccer rivalries, but they weren't above using deception on difficult targets. The Ritchie Boys discovered that the Nazis were terrified of ending up in Russian captivity, and they used that to great effect. If a German POW wouldn't talk, he might face Guy Stern dressed up as a Russian officer.
I had my whole uniform with medals, Russian medals, and I gave myself the name Kommissar Krukov.
That's what you called yourself?
That was my pseudonym.
How did you do, Commissar?
Thank you for asking. I gave myself all the accoutrements of looking like a fierce Russian commissar, and some we didn't break, but 80% were so darn scared of the Russians and what they would do.
So there's a real element of costumes and deception and accents.
Yes, and it's theatrics in a way. Yes.
Their subjects ranged from low-level German soldiers to high-ranking Nazi officers, including Hans Goebbels, brother of Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels. Another bit of indispensable Ritchie Boy handiwork, the order of battle of the German army. Paul Fairbrook helped write this compact manual, known as the Red Book, which outlined in great detail the makeup of virtually every Nazi unit, information every Ritchie Boy committed to memory.
When the soldier said, "I'm not going to talk," they could say, "Wait a minute, I know all about you. Look, I got a book here and it tells me that you were here and you were there and your boss was this," and they were impressed with that.
So it sounds like this gave the officers in the field a guide to the German army so they could then interrogate the German POWs more efficiently.
That's exactly right.
The Ritchie Boys earned a reputation for delivering important tactical information fast, making a major contribution to every battle on the Western Front.
The work they do in the field, being able to glean information simply from the uniform that a captured POW is wearing, or the type of weapon that they have, or the unit that they've just captured. That information is of critical importance because it tells you where certain units are. And if you know where certain units are, you know where the weak spots are, you know where the strong points are, and you know what to avoid and what to attack.
David Fry teaches history to cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
This is where having an intelligence officer from Camp Ritchie was of critical importance, because they would know this information. Your average commander in the field might not.
Their work saved lives?
Absolutely. They certainly saved lives. I think that's quantifiable. Part of what the Ritchie Boys did was to convince German units to surrender without fighting.
And you're saying some of that originated at Camp Ritchie?
Much of it originated at Camp Ritchie because it hadn't been done before. How do you appeal to people in their own language? And knowing how to shape that appeal was pretty critical to the success of the mobile broadcast units.
In trucks equipped with loudspeakers, Ritchie Boys went to the front lines under heavy fire and tried, in German, to persuade their Nazi counterparts to surrender. They also drafted and dropped leaflets from airplanes behind enemy lines.
This was one of the leaflets that was dropped out of
a plane. I have some that were shot. This one was our most effective leaflet. And why was that? Because Eisenhower had signed it, and the Germans had an incredibly naive approach to everything that was signed and sealed.
And you think because it had that signature, somehow that certified
that carried weight, and the belief in the printed matter was very great.
That's the kind of thing you would know as a former German who understood the psychology and the mentality.
That's correct.
Apart from the fighting, there were other threats confronting the Ritchie Boys. Given their foreign accents, they were in particular danger of being mistaken for the enemy by their own troops, who instituted passwords at checkpoints.
What happened to one of the Ritchie Boys? At night, on the way to the latrine, he was asked for a password. He gave the name, the word password, but with a German accent. He was shot right away and killed.
Did you ever worry your accent might get you killed?
Yes, of course. You know, I don't talk like an Alabama person or Texan.
Some Ritchie Boys were recruited to go on secret missions during the war. 97-year-old Max Lerner, an Austrian Jew fluent in German and French, served as a special agent with the Counterintelligence Corps, passing information to French underground resistance groups.
You were trained as a spy?
Yes.
What were you trained to do?
Wear civilian clothes, pass messages, kill.
This is going behind enemy lines. I mean, you're taking your life in your hands here.
Well, it was a war.
That's how you looked at it?
It was my war, and I needed to get my own back. I wanted desperately to do something.
At one point, Max Lerner disguised himself as a German officer and snuck behind enemy lines, leading a team of American soldiers into a German depot at night and destroying the equipment.
Did you worry what might happen if you were captured?
I wasn't smart enough.
What do you suspect might have happened?
Oh, I would have been killed.
By the spring of 1945, Allied forces neared Berlin, and Hitler took his life in his underground bunker. Germany surrendered on May 8th of that year.
What do you remember feeling that day?
Elated. It was absolutely, we won, kid.
And those are your comrades.
Yes.
Those are your guys.
Yes.
But joy turned to horror as Allied soldiers and the world learned the full scale of the Nazi mass extermination. Guy Stern recalls arriving at Buchenwald concentration camp 3 days after its liberation, alongside a fellow American sergeant.
We were walking along and you saw these emaciated, horribly looking, close to death people. And so I fell back behind because I didn't want to be seen crying to a hardened soldier. And then he looked around to look where I was, how I was delayed. And he, this good fellow from middle of Ohio, was bawling just as I was.
A few days later, Stern returned to the place of his birth, hoping to reunite with his family. But Hildesheim was now in ruins. A childhood friend described to Stern how his parents, younger brother, and sister had been forced from their home and deported.
They were killed either in Warsaw or in Auschwitz. None of my family survived. I was the only one to get out.
Did you ever ask yourself, why me? Why were you the one that made it to the United States?
Yes, even last night. And I said, well, in slang, there ain't nothing special about you. But if you were saved, you got to show that you were worthy of it. And that has been the driving force in my life.
There's a way to honor your family that perished.
Yeah.
After the German army's surrender, Guy Stern and the other Ritchie Boys took on a new assignment: hunting down top Nazi officers responsible for the atrocities that killed so many, including many of their loved ones. When we come back, we'll hear about some of the surprising ways Guy Stern and the other Ritchie Boys were able to identify suspected Nazi war criminals, many of whom later stood trial for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. The Ritchie Boys were members of a secret American intelligence group whose mastery of the German language and culture proved critical to the Allies' victory over Hitler. Many of them were Jewish refugees from Europe who fled their homeland, came to America, and joined the U.S. Army. After Hitler's defeat, many of them took on a challenging new assignment, using their language and interrogation skills to find and arrest top Nazi war criminals. What do you think is the greatest contribution of the Ritchie Boys?
I think it was the continuous flow of reliable information that really helped expedite the end of the war.
This had a real material impact on World War II.
Yes.
For 99-year-old Guy Stern, a German Jew whose entire family was killed by the Nazis, the Allies' victory over Hitler was the culmination of a public crusade and a private one as well.
Defeating the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS and all the fancy troops they had was a satisfaction, both as a team member and as a personal satisfaction. The very aspect of these SOBs now being at my command give me also some personal satisfaction.
After Germany's surrender, the Ritchie Boys took on the difficult task of identifying and tracking down Nazi criminals. Longtime Yale and Princeton professor Victor Brombert helped enact the official Allied policy of removing Nazi influence from German public life, known as denazification. So in May of 1945, Germany surrenders and you're assigned to the denazification process. What did that entail?
We were supposed to arrest important Nazi officials, not just any Nazi party member. It was very, very hard, very difficult, very rare to have a German denounce another German at that point. Now, is it because they were afraid that the Nazis might come back, that it's not over, or is it just a habit or habit of obedience or dignity? I don't know. And at great effort, we found people, we arrested them. We were proud of doing that.
As part of denazification, photos of Nazi atrocities were posted in German shop windows, and Ritchie Boys led the country's citizens on tours of the concentration camps to educate the local population about the evil Hitler had perpetrated. Sometimes entire German towns were forced to pay respects to the dead. Max Lerner was assigned to interview German civilians to help gauge the degree to which they had served the Nazi cause and determine which ones should be punished. I imagine all of a sudden no one wants to admit to being a Nazi.
There were no Nazis. They were all forced to it.
So that's what you were told. I'm denouncing this and I was forced to do it.
Yes. They were all justifying themselves. It was a terrible situation and I had no choice. I had no choice. That was the mantra. I would have been killed if I hadn't gone along.
Did you ever confront a Nazi who said this was morally reprehensible?
No.
Unprincipled and dishonorable and I'm sorry?
No.
Never?
Never.
One of the ways they identified subjects wanted for interrogation was by consulting this book, The Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, which listed enemy nationals suspected of committing tens of thousands of war crimes in Europe, everyone from low-ranking members of the armed forces to top Nazi officials. To Allied investigators, it became a sort of Nazi hunter's Bible. Did you enjoy hunting Nazis? Did it give you any satisfaction?
It gave me a great deal of satisfaction. Enjoy is perhaps not the right word, but it gave me a great deal of satisfaction.
Why specifically?
Because I remembered my parents. My father was 49 years old, my mother was 48, and they left everything they had built up behind and arrived in the United States penniless.
And you were able to confront the people that had caused this trauma?
Yes.
All SS members were subject to automatic arrest. Established by Hitler and led by Heinrich Himmler, the SS was responsible for security and intelligence collection in Germany. The SS controlled the German police forces and concentration camps, and directed the so-called final solution to kill all European Jews. Max Lerner recalls that, in one respect at least, identifying most SS members was easy.
You know how to tell an SS man.
How?
They have a tattoo of their blood group under their left arms.
SS men, you're saying, have a tattoo under their left arm with their blood type?
Yes. Or they had an effort to erase it.
The purpose of the tattoo was to identify a soldier's blood type in case a transfusion was needed, or if his dog tags went missing. Max Lerner recalls being put in charge of one prominent captured German prisoner at a jail in Wiesbaden, Germany. That was Julius Streicher, the founder and editor of the Nazi paper Der Stürmer, and one of the country's leading anti-Semites.
He spent several days in my jail, and I made sure he knew that it was a Jew who controlled him.
You let him know you were Jewish?
Oh, yes.
Streicher was later tried and convicted at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where concentration camp survivors who bore witness to the mass murder faced down their Nazi tormentors. Dozens of Ritchie Boys worked at the Nuremberg trials as prosecutors, interrogators, and translators. Ritchie Boys also collected evidence which led to the prosecution of many high-ranking Nazis, including Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler, and Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces.
The evidence relating to war crimes has been overwhelming in its volume and its detail.
All were convicted for their crimes, and many were executed. After the war, Guy Stern and the other Ritchie Boys were celebrated for their achievements.
The Bronze Star was given to me right at the end of hostilities. This is a good conduct medal, which I'm not really entitled to. And this year is the European Theater of Operations medal with 5 battles in which I participated.
Do you consider yourself a hero?
God, no. I tell you, when we landed on Omaha Beach, the whole heights had been occupied by the German artillery, and I looked up on those heights, and there were our American soldiers in full occupation on the day D+3, and I said to myself, that can't be done. And to take those heights against heavy firing, going up those steep cliffs, and of course it had been done. The evidence was before us. Those were the heroes.
Guy Stern returned to Normandy in 2016 to pay his respects to the more than 9,300 men buried in the American cemetery there, on the bluff overlooking the hallowed beach. Did the Ritchie Boys redefine what it means to be a soldier and contribute to a military?
I think they did, because they served in so many different capacities.
History professor David Fry runs the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
There were Ritchie Boys that were in the first wave on the first day at D-Day. There were Ritchie Boys who were in POW camps embedded and gathering information in the United States. Some didn't even go over to Europe. There were Ritchie Boys who were in virtually every battle that you can think of, and some actually suffered the worst fate. There were two who were actually captured at the Battle of the Bulge, and when their identity was discovered, they were summarily executed by the Germans that had captured them.
Because they were Jewish?
Because they were Jewish.
Wehrmacht Captain Kurt Bruns, convicted by a military tribunal of ordering the murder of those two Ritchie Boys, was executed by a firing squad in June 1945. After the war, the Ritchie Boys continued their work. 98-year-old Paul Fairbrook helped set up the German military documents section at Camp Ritchie, a vast catalog of more than 20,000 captured German documents.
They sent us back to Camp Ritchie, and they created something that I call the equivalent of the Library of Congress. We got a lot of German prisoners who were willing to help us catalog all those documents.
The project detailed every aspect of the German army's operations during the war, including how they were structured, how they mobilized, and how they used intelligence. The U.S. War Department used this collection of German documents to study Germany's battles with the Soviets on the Eastern Front, in order to be better prepared for any future conflict with Russia.
So there's all sorts of impact years and years and years after the war from this camp in Maryland.
Right. It was not only that short-term impact on the battlefield, it was an impact on war crimes, then shaping the Cold War era. They really played a significant role.
After the war, Guy Stern, Victor Brombert, Paul Fairbrook, and Max Lerner came home, married, and went to Ivy League schools on the GI Bill. Guy Stern became a professor and taught for almost 50 years. They all rose to the top of their fields, as did a number of other Ritchie Boys.
I understand there's some Ritchie Boys became fairly prominent figures.
There are a whole variety of prominent Ritchie Boys.
It turns out that author J.D. Salinger was a Ritchie Boy. So was Archibald Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, as was philanthropist David Rockefeller and media baron and billionaire John Kluge.
Some became ambassadors. Others were actually really important in American science.
And notably, Professor Fry says, more than 250 Ritchie Boys continued to work in the field of intelligence after the war, becoming professional spies.
Many of those who trained at Camp Ritchie actually did go on to the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. That meant that the people who learned their craft at Camp Ritchie played a significant role in setting up what eventually became the CIA.
How do you think we should be recalling the Ritchie Boys?
I think we look at this group and we see true heroes. We see those who are the greatest of the greatest generation. These are people who made massive contributions, who helped shape what it meant to be American, and who, in some cases, gave their lives in service to this country.
This is a remarkable story. Why do so few Americans know about this?
Because it involves military intelligence, much of it was actually kept secret until the 1990s. A lot of what was learned and the methods used are important to keep secret. And only in the early 2000s did we begin to see reunions of the Ritchie Boys.
Now in their late 90s, these humble warriors still keep in touch, swapping stories about a chapter in American history now finally being told.
What is it like when you get together and reflect on this experience going on 80 years ago?
We always find another anecdote to tell.
You have a smile on your face when you think back.
Yes, this is what happened.
It was hard for us not to notice that beyond the stories runs a deep sense of pride.
You bet your life I'm proud of the Ritchie Boys. It was wonderful to be part of them. I was proud to be in the American Army, and we were able to do what we had to do. I don't think we're heroes, but the opportunity to help fight and win the war was a wonderful way. I can look anybody straight in the eye and I said, I think I've earned the right to be an American. And that's what it did for me.
Kevin Mallory was a down-on-his-luck former clandestine case officer for the CIA when he was approached by a man the Department of Justice believes was a Chinese spy. Officials say Mallory was a prime target for recruitment. He was out of work, 3 months behind on his mortgage, and thousands of dollars in debt. But as the Chinese would discover, Kevin Mallory wasn't exactly James Bond. The Department of Justice agreed to show us how they caught Mr. Mallory and why they believe his recruitment by China is part of a massive clandestine campaign to steal not just national security secrets from the U.S. government, but industrial and technological secrets from American companies. This is what espionage looks like. The man standing on the right in the yellow shirt is Kevin Mallory, who once held a top-secret security clearance while working for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Footage from a surveillance camera at a Virginia FedEx store in April last year caught him as he prepared to hand a clerk stacks of classified documents to be scanned onto an SD card, the kind that can be inserted into a mobile phone.
So this is the rare moment, right, in an investigation and in an espionage case where we actually have video footage of the individual preparing the classified material for transmission to the Foreign Intelligence Service.
We watched the tape with Ryan Gaynor, the FBI's supervisory special agent who investigated Mallory, and Jennifer Jelly, who prosecuted the case against him for the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. They say Kevin Mallory sent national security secrets to a Chinese spy on a covert communication device.
So here you see him talking with the store clerk about the scanning job. And throughout this video, you see little pops of yellow, little yellow pieces of paper that flash by when he's showing the document. That was important for us because the document that he successfully passed consisted of a typed up white piece of paper. That was the classified information, followed by 2 yellow sheets of paper with his handwriting on them. And here you can see.
So those are the yellow sheets of paper.
You can see the yellow sheets going through that scanning process.
Prosecutors say some of the information Mallory sent could have revealed the identity of a couple who had secretly spied on China for the U.S. It was a very personal betrayal. Mallory had supervised the couple years before.
He was betraying people. This is people's lives at stake.
Correct. These were documents that specifically talked about human beings whose lives could be in danger.
If they had traveled to China, they could have been arrested.
At the time he gave the information to the Chinese intelligence officer, he knew they were planning on traveling to China.
John Demers is the top official in charge of the Department of Justice's National Security Division, which helps guard the U.S. against terrorism, cyber attacks, and espionage. He's responsible for coordinating activities across law enforcement and U.S. intelligence agencies. He says Kevin Mallory's recruitment is just one of many efforts by the Chinese Ministry of State Security, or MSS, to spy on the United States.
What is MSS?
So MSS is the principal intelligence agency of the Chinese government. And in rough terms, it is like the CIA and FBI put together. Their capabilities are world-class. They have cyber capabilities. They have expertise in turning people into cooperators, and they have all of the tools and expertise of a very capable intelligence organization.
John Demers says Kevin Mallory hadn't worked for any U.S. intelligence agency in 5 years, but he was still of interest to China. He spoke Mandarin, was desperate for money, and had classified information he might be willing to sell.
You're looking for people who will be willing to work with you for one reason or another. You start very slowly. You start to see what information they're willing to share with you. Originally innocuous information, then something maybe slightly more sensitive, and so forth. And that relationship develops over time. It's a patient process.
It's a grooming of an intelligence asset.
It's a grooming, and it's a constant testing to see what the person is willing to do.
The Chinese didn't reach out to Kevin Mallory in a dark alley like in a movie. They made contact with him like any job recruiter would. They sent him a message on the career networking site LinkedIn.
What could the Chinese tell from reading his LinkedIn page?
When you look at this LinkedIn page, it's very clear immediately that he worked in national security, that he had the type of background that the Chinese intelligence services are most interested in.
He's good at national security, military, international relations, counterterrorism, security clearance, dispute resolution. This is a signpost to, I was a former intelligence official.
And it led to what you would expect.
Mallory ended up in contact with this man, who called himself Michael Yang, and claimed to be an employee at a Chinese think tank.
So he's a Chinese intelligence officer?
We believe him to be a Chinese intelligence officer, and more importantly, Mr. Mallory, when meeting with him, believed him to be an intelligence officer.
Over the next several weeks, Michael Yang paid Mallory $25,000 to come to Shanghai twice, and Mallory reached out to former colleagues at the CIA asking to be put in touch with people who had current intelligence on China. Prosecutors say his former colleagues grew suspicious and reported him to CIA security, putting him on the radar of law enforcement. When Mallory returned from his second trip to China, he was stopped by customs at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. He had lied on this form about how much money he was carrying, more than $16,000 in cash, and agents discovered this box with a phone in it. Mallory claimed it was a gift for his wife, but it was actually a covert communication device that had been given to him by Chinese intelligence.
This looks just like a regular phone. What makes it a covert communication device?
So it's not so much the hardware. The phone itself had a unique piece of software installed on it designed to allow secure communication both in text and also the secure transmission of documents later.
You might think a former CIA officer would be cautious about the texts he sends to a Chinese spy. But Kevin Mallory was remarkably direct, complaining about the money he was paid and the risk he was taking. "Your object is to gain information," he told Michael Yang, "and my object is to be paid for." "I'll destroy all electronic records after you confirm receipt," Mallory wrote to Yang. "I already destroyed the paper records. I cannot keep these around. Too dangerous. At this point, all the risk is on me."
So he says, I'm taking all the risk, but then he goes on a few bubbles later to actually try to transmit additional information to the Chinese.
But technology wasn't Mallory's strong suit. He complained to Michael Yang that the phone wasn't working properly. "This system sucks. It's too cumbersome," he wrote. "I put all these messages and you can't read them because you're not logged in the same time. That's a poor system." At this point, prosecutors say Mallory was scared. He'd been stopped at customs and he feared the CIA and FBI were onto him. Prosecutors say he decided to come up with a cover story and reached out to the CIA, telling them he thought he was being recruited by Chinese spies. The CIA called him in for an interview.
My judgment is, and we haven't got through this conversation, that these guys work for Chinese intelligence. So my sense is that they were looking for government secrets, U.S. government secrets at some level.
In this meeting, Mallory admitted the phone was a covert communication device given to him by the Chinese. But prosecutors say he lied about the classified documents he'd already sent.
Did you send them anything on that phone? I sent them some tests of some sort just to see if I could do it right, and I couldn't figure it out. I messed that up.
He's trying to control the narrative. So what you have here likely is an attempt to steer the story, to explain away some of the more alerting pieces while not admitting to the criminal activity of providing the classified information to the Foreign Intelligence Service.
We now know that at this point in time, Kevin Mallory has successfully sent the classified table of contents, the classified white paper, and tried to send several other documents unsuccessfully.
Mallory offered to bring in the phone to be examined by the CIA, confident that all his messages to Michael Yang had automatically been deleted.
So he believes everything he sent has disappeared from the device. So that's why he's willing to bring the device in.
We have every reason to believe that he believed at the time that those communications would be gone.
2 weeks later, Mallory arrived at a hotel room in Ashburn, Virginia, for a second meeting with the CIA. When he got there, the FBI was waiting for him, along with a computer forensic examiner. He agreed to show them how the phone worked.
When he goes to demonstrate it, up on the screen where he expects to have his whole chat history basically deleted, up on the screen comes some of the chat history.
The FBI recorded the meeting.
I'm surprised it kept this much. So you made a comment that you're surprised that there was this much there.
Right, because in the past, maybe it's a screen size, because some of it's just disappeared.
One of the most incriminating messages that appeared on the phone was Mallory planning another trip to China. "I can also come in the middle of June," he wrote. "I can bring the remainder of the documents I have at that time."
From the FBI perspective, this is a pivotal moment in the investigation.
4 weeks later, the FBI arrested Kevin Mallory and searched his home. Hidden in the back of this closet in a junk drawer, agents discovered an SD card wrapped in tin foil on which he'd placed 8 secret and top-secret documents, the same ones he scanned at that FedEx store last April.
It is our belief that it was intention to take this SD card to China to provide to them.
Does the Mallory case fit a pattern that you're seeing coming from Chinese intelligence?
Yes. We currently have 3 pending cases against former intelligence officers, and they're alleged to have been spying on behalf of the Chinese.
It's hard to overstate how unusual it is to have 3 cases like this ongoing.
It's not unusual, it's unprecedented.
To me, it's disappointing, and it's really hurtful, I think, to everyone to know that we still have people who are willing to betray the U.S. for a few dollars.
Bill Evanina is director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, a division of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He serves as the U.S. government's top counterintelligence official. When it comes to espionage against the United States, does China pose the greatest threat or Russia?
When it comes to espionage, China poses the greatest threat, and it's not even close compared to Russia or Iran or any other country. And if you include economic espionage, industrial espionage, it's not even in the same ballgame.
When most people think of espionage, they think of somebody in a trench coat trying to steal a state's secret. What's happening now with China, it's not just about state secrets, it's about technological secrets. That's the prize that China wants.
That's correct. It's trade secrets, proprietary data, intelligence, emerging technology, nanotechnology, hybrid, anything that they can see that is the future, supercomputing, encryption. Those are the issues that they look at, and they have a prioritized schedule that they look at, and they send people forward to go collect that data.
John Demers of the Justice Department's National Security Division says since 2011, more than 90% of the economic espionage cases they've charged have involved China, which has stolen secrets about everything from genetically modified rice seeds to wind turbine technology. This is a persistent campaign you're seeing.
Yes, very persistent, very sophisticated, very well resourced, very patient, and very broad in scope.
Demers says Chinese operatives have intensified their efforts on industries critical to Chinese President Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 program, a 10-year plan to jump ahead of the United States in aerospace, automation, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other cutting-edge industries. I think some people who see this are going to think, well, this is something the U.S. must do as well.
The U.S. intelligence community doesn't take trade secrets from foreign companies for the benefit of American companies. This is not something that we do.
As for former CIA officer Kevin Mallory, he continues to deny sending any classified information to the Chinese. This past June, a jury in Virginia found him guilty of conspiracy under the Espionage Act and lying to the FBI. Mallory is currently awaiting sentencing and faces up to life in prison.
The name David Cornwell is probably unfamiliar to most of you, but he's an interesting person to talk to in these days of alleged political conspiracies, espionage, and a rekindling of the Cold War. He's an expert on secrets, a former spy himself, and the author of 24 books, virtually all of them bestsellers, written under the pen name of John Le Carré. Among them are The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, The Little Drummer Girl, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Constant Gardener, and The Night Manager, all of which have been made into films. He is not just a popular writer of thrillers, he is a novelist of some standing, often compared to Graham Greene, Joseph Conrad, and Somerset Maugham. Cornwell has been living this double life for more than 50 years now and rarely gives television interviews. But upon the publication of his 24th novel, A Legacy of Spies, we were invited to spend a few days with this literary lion in winter. To find his natural habitat, you must journey 6 hours from London, through farmland and down one-lane country roads lined with hedgerow and blackthorn, to a corner of England so remote it's known as Land's End. Here, nestled on a cliff in Cornwall, you will find John Le Carré's safe house.
So this is where you escaped to?
Yeah. It was as far from London as I could get, reasonably. I guess the other thing to say about this place which is very important to me, is that the Cornish don't give a damn for celebrity. If they even know what I do, they haven't read it, or if they have read it, they make a point of not being impressed by it. And that is enormously soothing.
Yes.
Not a head turns in the street when I walk by.
It's here, in the home he fashioned out of 3 derelict cottages more than 40 years ago, that he weaves together the threads of memory, experience, and research into his tales of intrigue. The solitude is a stimulation.
You've said many times that you don't like giving interviews.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then I defect from that position.
It's very clear that almost every interview you've given over the last 10 years, you've told them that this is
the last one.
The last one.
It always is.
Well, I take the fact that you're still giving interviews, that you're aging better than you thought you would.
I think that's perfectly true. Each book feels like my last book, and then I think, like a dedicated alcoholic, that one more won't do me any harm.
David Cornwell's not a functioning alcoholic, but he's created a stable full of imperfect characters over the years as John Le Carré, a name he does not answer to. It's an abstraction that exists in his writing studio and on the cover of his books, like a spy's name on a phony passport.
John Le Carré is sort of a cover.
It's a separate identity in a way, and you can look after it. And looking after Le Carré and keeping myself young, keeping the child in me alive, keeping the critical nature of life whizzing in my head, that's being Le Carré.
Is there any space between David and John?
Yes, I think a lot, really. David tries to be a good dad and a regular guy with difficulty, many flaws. And John takes off into the ether. He's the man of imagination. And I can take John for a walk, let him loose on the cliffs, and he has a good time, and he populates the empty cliffs with the people of his imagination. And then I come back and help with the washing up.
Le Carré was created by Cornwell in 1961, out of necessity, not choice. It happened during his first career as a spy for British intelligence, both at home and abroad. To satisfy a creative urge, he began writing fiction on his commute to work and during lunchtime.
Why did you need a pen name?
Well, a hard practical reason. I was still in secret harness, as you might say. I wrote my first 3 books from inside the intelligence world. The books had to be approved by my masters, and were, but a condition was I had to choose a pen name. So I went to my publisher.
His publisher preferred short and snappy. Cornwell wanted something interesting, mysterious, and French.
I've told many lies about how it came about because I truly don't clearly remember. But I think I wanted, architecturally, a name in three parts. And I thought the acute accent at the end, these were eye-catching things. So instead of trying to look like everybody else, I tried to look a bit different as a name. And then somebody who is Carre as a gentleman is not quite a gentleman. That suits me fine.
That attitude doesn't just suit Cornwell, it actually defines him. He has the wealth, the education, and the bearing of a polished patrician, but he'll never be part of the English upper class, which he abhors. Plus, he has the pedigree of a rogue.
I mean, you must realize that I'm an upstart. I do come originally from a working class family. I went kind of from working class to middle class to criminal class, which was finally my father's condition. And I had to invent myself as a gentleman, a pseudo-gentleman. So it's a good American story of self-invention.
He was 5 years old when his mother Olive deserted the family, leaving him and his older brother Tony under the chaotic charge of their father Ronnie, a colorful, charismatic con man and crook.
If there remains one great conundrum in my life, it is my father, who seems to me to inspire also some of the worst or best characters in me. He had a wonderful brain. Everybody who worked for him was in awe of his intellect. But if there was a bent way of doing something, he took it.
A rich vein of material for you to mine.
Wonderful, wonderful, rich vein of material, and very painful.
Ronnie ran with a fast crowd, celebrities, sportsmen, and mobsters. There were racehorses at Ascot and trips to San Moritz. They lived either as millionaires or paupers. One week a chauffeured Bentley, the next on the run from bill collectors or worse.
He'd done quite a lot of jail, and he spent some years of his life on the run in late middle age. So it was a mess, just a bloody mess. But surviving it was also a privilege to be part of it in some strange way. It taught you a lot about life, lowered your expectations, raised them in other ways.
What did you learn?
I learned, I think, to understand the wideness, the width of the spectrum of human behavior. And I guess I learned the perils of charm, which he exercised ruthlessly with huge success. And I learned about the insecurity of the world, that everything is transient, even our money, our future, our lives, our children, everything.
He was always an excellent student, and by the time he graduated from Oxford with a degree in modern languages, he'd already learned from his father some of the prerequisites of a career in espionage: lying, manipulation, and deception. When he was approached by a recruiter for the British Secret Service, it seemed like a seamless transition.
When it comes to recruiting people for the secret world, what the recruiters are looking for is pretty much what I had. I was unanchored, looking for an institution to look after me. I had a bit of larceny. I understood larceny. I understood the natural criminality in people because it was all around me, and I've no doubt there was a chunk of it inside me too. Once I'd found that identity, it took root in me. It exactly, it gelled with the world that I'd known in the past.
He began in London, running agents, keeping tabs on subversives and spies, and learning the trade craft. He moved to the foreign branch, MI6, at the height of the Cold War, posing as a young diplomat at the British Embassy in West Germany, just as the Berlin Wall was going up.
What were you doing when you were working for MI6?
In Germany, I never talk about that.
You can't?
No. I would never be comfortable talking about it, and I think you'd find that with most people who've been in that world. It is simply anathema.
Whatever David Cornwell's duties were, John Le Carré found time to write a novel about a washed-up spy named Alec Lemus, who was sent on a dangerous mission across the wall and betrayed by his bosses.
My memory is that I wrote it very fast, the story, that I had no idea where I was going at first, and it just flowed. And I think you get a break like that once in your writing life. I really believe nothing else came to me so naturally, so fast.
You had to show it to...
I then showed it to my department, and there was a bit of a loud silence. And then, actually in a kind of sporting decency almost, my service said, okay, go ahead and publish it. But I think they had no idea, any more than I did, that it would become a sensation.
The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was the publishing event of 1963. The book spent 34 weeks as #1 on the bestseller list and was made into an acclaimed motion picture starring Richard Burton and Claire Bloom.
Got a man coming over tonight.
Both the novel and the film served as gray, gritty antidotes to the fantastical world of James Bond.
He'll bluff his way through. He's got papers if the papers are any good.
And were accepted by critics and the public as an authentic portrayal of the scruffy business of espionage.
What the hell do you think spies are? Moral philosophers measuring everything they do against the word of God or Karl Marx? They're not. They're just a bunch of seedy, squalid bastards like me. Little men, drunkards, queers, henpecked husbands, civil servants playing cowboys and Indians to brighten their rotten little lives. Do you think they sit like monks in a cell balancing right against wrong?
The book would make John Le Carré a famous and much-in-demand author. But for months, only British intelligence knew who and where he was, and it did not want to blow Cornwell's cover in Germany.
People didn't know it was you?
No, they didn't, until the Sunday Times blew the whistle. And then the whole investigation of my person, as you might say, came up. Was I a spook? Was I not a spook? And I, out of loyalty to my service and out of some sense of privacy, went on insisting that I'd had no intelligence experience until it became absurd. And it became absurd largely because my colleagues and my superior officers were either boasting or complaining to anybody who would listen that I'd written the book.
Spooks are generally wary of unscripted publicity, so he and the agency eventually agreed to part ways, allowing him and Le Carré to concentrate full-time on fiction, not unlike his father, Ronnie.
You have mused on at least one occasion about whether there's much of a difference between what you do for a living and what he did.
Well, I think that's kind of me.
What were you talking about specifically?
Well, I was saying that I live off my wits, as he did. I look around, I collect bits of people, I assemble them, I pitch a story, I sell it. He, as a con man, does much the same. I do it on the page, and he does it with human material. But what that doesn't take account of is what happens to the human material.
You said, and I don't know what the context was, but I've seen this quote a number of times. You said, I'm a liar, born to lying, bred to it, trained to it by an industry that lies for a living.
Yeah. All of that's true. Actually, it's a dreadful confession, but these days I tell the truth.
When we come back, we'll visit two of Le Carré's favorite inventions, the London Circus and George Smiley, who both reappear after an absence of nearly 30 years in his new book, A Legacy of Spies, plus a walk through his writing studio and his thoughts about today's world. For the most part, the novels of David Cornwell, written under the name John Le Carré, are about spies and espionage. That's the subject matter, anyway, and the setting. But they're also about human nature and behavior, about honor, ambition, careerism, and conflicting loyalties that could apply to any profession. It's a way of writing large about the small world of secret intelligence services that Cornwell was a part of, and not a bad way, he says, to take measure of a nation's political health.
You feel that you've got a hand somehow on the subconscious of the nation. You feel you know what the greatest anxieties are and the greatest ambitions are.
In Le Carré's world, the headquarters of the British intelligence services existed some years ago in an imaginary building off the theatre district in central London.
London Station couldn't be in better hands.
As portrayed in his books and the movies about them, this den of spies was a drab bureaucracy populated by eccentric characters working in a long-neglected Victorian pile of bricks called the circus.
About time someone oiled this thing, isn't it? We keep asking.
It was not exactly an accurate description of the real thing, Cornwell says, but it was credible.
It was an abstraction from reality.
Was it known as the circus to the people who worked there?
No, it wasn't.
That comes from your imagination.
I lifted the building, body and soul, as you might say, replanted it in Cambridge Circus, different part of London, and it was known by the shorthand as the circus. And what better name for a community of performing spies than the circus.
There were scalp hunters, lamplighters, honey traps, and moles.
All of this came from your imagination?
Yes, I mean, something always sparks the imagination, and mine was sparked and took off, and I thought this is a kind of half-dream world which I can inform from experience, and it fits.
People who work there recognize it.
It isn't as if they recognize this operation or that operation. What they recognize is the smell and the authenticity of, I hope, of the life that we led. Secret Service headquarters is down on the right-hand side.
In London, Cornwell took us on a cab ride to see the actual building where he worked and that used to house MI6 headquarters.
And it was dusty and smelly, and it smelled of sort of Nescafe and fags. People smoked. Everybody seemed to smoke. A lot of alcohol. A lot of alcohol.
It's now an office building not far from Buckingham Palace.
Was there much security?
There was no security at all. I mean, none that was visible. You walked in and out once you were a familiar face, and it was good morning, Mr. Cornwell, good morning, this. I mean, hello, Bell, hello, sir. And when you came back from abroad, it was always welcome back, sir.
But nobody searched the bags going in and out?
No. I never knew of anyone being stopped and searched.
There would be a price paid for the complacency when MI6's most notorious double agent, the Cambridge-educated spy Kim Philby, waltzed out the door with some of Britain's most valuable secrets and handed them over to the Soviet Union. The incident was an inspiration for Cornwell's most memorable success, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. The book and this BBC adaptation are about the search for a Russian mole at the highest level of the circus.
We were rotten apple, and the maggots are eating up the circus.
Conducted by Le Carré's portly spy master and favorite character, George Smiley.
It's a very close bond. George Smiley is my secret sharer, my companion. And I think that because I'm given to exaggerated emotions at times, Smiley moderates me as a writer.
The character, played by Alec Guinness in this BBC version, is about as close as Le Carré gets to a hero. At best middle-aged, a hapless cuckold, he is measured, sensible, clever, and devoted to his job.
What do you like best about Smiley?
I think how he toughs it out.
Survivor.
More than that, he does a good job.
Tidy up.
And much of it is distasteful to him. But he has a sense of duty, and he has a sense of moral obligation, and a sense of balance.
George, you won.
He's made a lot of compromises with life.
Did I?
And it's actually...
Yes. Yes, I suppose I did.
His greatest operational weapon is his humanity.
It's been nearly 30 years since Smiley and his old circus performers have appeared in a Le Carré novel, but some of them are back for the new one, A Legacy of Spies, and unceremoniously called to account at the gleaming new MI6 headquarters for the sins, failures, and betrayals committed decades earlier in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
This struck me as something you've been wanting to do for a while.
Well, it is. In the first place, the characters never left me. In some curious way, particularly Smiley, they became, even if I wasn't writing about them, they became quite conscious companions at times in my imagination. And what I wanted to do at this stage, this point of closure in the Smiley saga, now 50, 60 years on, was have the present interrogate the past about what we did then in the Cold War in the name of freedom, and was it worth it? And it was in this mood, very much, that I concluded the book and the search for George Smiley, which for me was some kind of search for truth. In The Spy Who Came In From the Cold...
What he loves best about writing is the privacy of it. Every day, sometime after 7 a.m., he climbs the steps to his studio and begins putting pen to paper.
And this is my workroom. If there are family crises and things like that, I edit them out until midday. This is from Legacy. And this is Peter Gwilym, the central figure, who's narrating. I have two visions simultaneously. The first of George, as George Smiley, and Alec, that's Alec Lemus, huddled head-to-head in the chilly conservatory in Bywater Street. Rare use of an adjective by me.
Most of the material comes from notebooks he's filled on long walks or epic research trips he's taken to capture the feel and smell of faraway places he puts his characters.
This is all the very raw material.
These notes were jotted down in Kenya while he was writing The Constant Gardener.
These are things I saw. Battens, a panga from somewhere. The man lies in the recovery pose, bathed in blood from the head down, dead or going there. In Nairobi, murder is one of the few industries that live up to expectation.
There are no computers involved in this process. He edits with scissors and a stapler.
And that's the extract.
And hands the good bits off to his personal typist and copy editor, Jane Cornwell, his wife of 45 years. She is also chief operating officer of his life and various enterprises.
Like all writers, I've lived a messy, untidy life, inevitably so. And she's been wonderfully supportive, and it's always go to Jane if you need to get to David, because she's got her feet on the ground. God knows where he's got his feet.
Cornwell has been writing as John Le Carré for so long, no one could tell us how many millions of books he's sold over the last 5.5 decades. They've been printed in 43 different languages.
How do you think of yourself as a writer?
Wow. Storyteller. So we're sitting in front of a fire. I want to keep you in your chair. I want to interest you. I want you to want to turn the page. But I don't really think too much about the posterity. And I certainly don't join the literary argument about where I stand. Am I a quality novelist? Am I a popular novelist? Am I a thriller writer? To me, if I'd gone to sea, I'd have written about the sea. If I'd gone into stockbroking, I'd have written about the stockbroking world.
You've turned down literary honors. You've turned down a knighthood.
Yes.
Why?
In my own country, I'm so suspicious of the literary world that I don't want its accolades. And least of all do I want to be called a commander of the British Empire or any other thing of the British Empire. I find it emetic.
And why do you feel that way?
I don't want to posture as somebody who's been honored by the state and must therefore somehow conform with the state. And I don't want to wear the armor.
Your writing partner, George Smiley, had this to say on the subject. The privately educated Englishman is the greatest dissembler on earth. No one will charm you so glibly, disguise his feelings from you better, cover his tracks more skillfully, or find it harder to confess that he's been a damn fool. No one acts braver when he's frightened stiff, or happier when he's miserable. And nobody can flatter you better when he hates you than an extrovert Englishman or woman.
Yeah, I think that's very good.
You like that graph?
I like that. Yes, I do.
Do you consider yourself an Englishman?
What kind of Englishman at the moment? Yes, of course, I'm born and bred English. I'm English to the core. My England would be the one that recognizes its place in the European Union, the jingoistic England that is trying to march us out of the EU. That is an England I don't want to know.
Like most Europeans, Cornwell has no use for President Donald Trump and his nationalistic agenda, which he calls alarming and contagious. And he worries about the ambitions of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I think today's spooks working on the Russian front, British spooks, would tell you that it's just as bad as it was in the Cold War. Putin sees everything in terms of conspiracy, and his grip on the Russian populace is so strong that he has resorted to all the old systems that he was familiar with. So we're right back to where we were in the Cold War, with the added mission that Putin has given to himself to erode decent democracy wherever he sees it.
So much has changed in the world of espionage since you first began. I mean, you have the introduction now of cyber war, you have computer hacking, you have all of this stuff. You wonder, is it possible to keep any secrets at all? And do we need spies, any human spies?
I think probably in many ways more than ever. In some ways, the techniques of intelligence and the techniques of maintaining secrets have gone backwards. If you and I are going to enter into a conspiracy now, we don't do it through the ether. We don't do it by computer. We exchange notes. We either hand each other notes, we keep paper again. Paper's back in. Secondly, you very, very often need an agent on the spot who is going to deliver the piece of paper, the code number, the simple clue to it all.
Mostly right now, David Cornwell and John Le Carré are recovering from, celebrating, and lamenting publication of this last novel, strange as that may seem.
You said the most depressing time in your life is when you finished a book.
Yes, yes.
Which is what you're going through right now.
Which is exactly what I'm going through right now. Thank you for lightening my load. Yeah, it's a feeling of you've depleted everything you've been working on. It's done, it's out there. And then out of the ashes of the last book, so to speak, comes the phoenix of the new one, and then life's okay again. But the depression that overtakes me when I've turned in a book, I must confess, is real and deep.
Do you have an idea for the next book?
Absolutely, I can't wait to get to it.